Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm very glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable if you can. Settle into the chair, the couch, the bed, wherever this story has found you. Maybe the room around you is quiet. Maybe there is still some traffic outside. Maybe you have a lamp on. Maybe the screen in your hand is the brightest thing nearby. And before we begin, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening late, when the day has already worn itself out, or earlier, while there is still some noise left in the world? You can tell me in the comments if you feel like it. I always like knowing where these stories are landing. Tonight we're going somewhere that most histories of war mention only in passing. Not into a command tent where maps are spread across folding tables. Not onto a rooftop where a sniper waits. Not into the green glow of night vision footage that becomes the image people carry in their minds whenever they think about modern war. We're going onto a road in Iraq, sometime between 2003 and 2011, where a line of armoured vehicles and cargo trucks is preparing to move from one secured place to another. That may not sound dramatic at first. A road trip, after all, is usually one of the least alarming things a person can do. You check the fuel, adjust the mirror, complain about the seat, and hope the person controlling the music has decent judgment. But in Iraq during those years, a convoy was not a simple trip from one point to another. It was a moving target, a work shift, a test of concentration, a routine that never became truly routine. And for many of the people inside those vehicles, one of the most nerve-wracking parts of the war. The invasion of Iraq began in March 2003, but the years that followed were defined not only by battles and raids, but by the daily need to move fuel, food, water, ammunition, spare parts, equipment, and people across a country where the roads themselves became part of the conflict. If this kind of slow, detail-rich storytelling speaks to you, it would mean a great deal if you gave the video a like and subscribe to the channel. You do not have to do it now. Do it when the story has earned it. When a detail catches you off guard, when a scene becomes easier to picture than you expected, when history stops feeling distant for a moment. That is the best time. And now, let us begin with a convoy before it has gone anywhere at all. Picture a military base in Iraq before dawn. The exact year could be 2004, or 2006, or 2009. The war changed over time, and the vehicles changed with it, but certain parts of the experience remained familiar. There is a motor pool or a staging area lit by hard artificial lamps. Engines have already started in some of the vehicles, and they sit there idling with a steady mechanical patience. A truck coughs once, settles, and keeps running. Someone climbs down from a cab and walks around the vehicle again, checking what has already been checked. A strap on a load is pulled tight. A latch is tested. A tyre is looked at longer than necessary because once the convoy leaves the gate, a small problem can become a much larger one. Nearby, people stand in body armour with helmets clipped, chin straps loose or fastened depending on where they are in the process. Some carry coffee, some are silent. Some are talking more than usual because talking can be a useful way of filling the time before movement begins. The convoy might contain gun trucks, armoured Humvees, later MRAPs, cargo vehicles, fuel tankers, wreckers, route security, military police, or contracted logistics vehicles depending on the mission and the year. The US Army's Transportation Corps later described soldiers on these roads as frontline soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is a revealing phrase. It tells you that the old distinction between rear area logistics and frontline fighting had become much harder to maintain. When supply routes were vulnerable, the people moving supplies were not behind the war, they were inside it. A convoy begins long before the wheels turn. It begins with a route. Somewhere, a stretch of road has been selected, reviewed, discussed, and weighed against the risks of every other stretch of road. It begins with a time of departure, morning, night, or an hour that feels like neither. It begins with spacing between vehicles, radio frequencies, call signs, reaction plans, vehicle order, lead elements, trail elements, and what will happen if the convoy stops. That last part matters more than people outside the war might immediately understand. On a normal highway, traffic slows and everyone groans. In Iraq, a stopped convoy could become exposed. A disabled vehicle could change the entire rhythm of the mission. A blocked road could turn an ordinary movement into a waiting game no one wanted to play. By the middle years of the war, American forces had learned through painful experience that the roads could be dangerous in ways that did not always announce themselves. The threat was not limited to a visible gunman or an approaching vehicle. It might be a buried device near a shoulder, an explosive concealed in ordinary roadside clutter, or an ambush waiting for a convoy to slow in a predictable place. In 2008, the Government Accountability Office reported that improvised explosive devices accounted for about 3/4 of casualties in then-current operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. One reason the Pentagon moved urgently to field MRAP vehicles in large numbers. That statistic does not tell you everything about convoy life, but it explains why the act of driving became such a serious matter. A vehicle's armour, its shape, its equipment, and its position in the line could all become matters of life and death. Before leaving, someone gives a brief. It may be formal, it may be quick, it may be repeated from a familiar routine, but everyone listens because routine does not make risk disappear. The route is named, the destination is named, the order of march is reviewed. The mission may sound straightforward on paper. Move supplies from one base to another, escort logistics vehicles, return with empty trailers, support a unit farther north, bring equipment south. There are no sweeping words in most of this. Logistics is not usually spoken about in heroic language while it is happening. It is lists, timings, manifests, fuel, radio checks, and a great deal of waiting. Yet an army that cannot move supplies does not remain functional for long. During the Iraq War, sustainment convoys and combat logistics patrols were central to keeping the dispersed US presence operating across the country, and army logistics publications of the period treated these movements as combat missions requiring careful planning and force protection. That is part of what made convoy duty so strange. A mission could be repetitive without ever becoming harmless. The same route might be travelled again and again. The same road signs, the same overpasses, the same burned-out structure in the distance, the same stretch of emptiness that always made someone sit a little straighter. Drivers learned the roads by memory. Gunners learned where the road narrowed, where traffic clustered, where visibility changed. Commanders learned which places made radios crackle with more urgency. Yet familiarity had limits. A road that was quiet yesterday could be dangerous today. A location that had been ordinary for weeks could become the place where everything changed. Official army accounts of attacks in 2004 describe insurgents targeting convoys along important routes, using IEDs and direct fire to interrupt traffic and isolate moving elements. That pattern became one of the defining realities of the war's road network. Imagine being inside one of those vehicles before departure. The interior does not feel spacious. It is crowded with gear, water bottles, ammunition, radios, personal items tucked wherever they fit, and the stiff architecture of a military vehicle designed around function rather than comfort. A soldier checks a weapon that has already been checked. Another adjusts gloves. Someone reaches for a packet of something edible, then decides not to open it yet. The driver's hands rest near the wheel. The person in the passenger seat may have a map, a radio, or both. If there is a gunner above, that person occupies a different world. Even before leaving the gate, the gunner is partly outside, partly exposed, scanning, while everyone else waits in relative enclosure. The view from that position matters. It is wider. It is more useful. It is also more demanding. There is an important temptation when telling stories about war to make every moment loud. That is not how convoy movement always felt. Some of the most difficult minutes were quiet. The quiet before the gate opened. The quiet after the route briefing ended. The quiet of engines running while no one had anything else to say. the quiet that left enough space for each person to think about the road ahead in their own way. Some were veterans of many missions, some were new. Some had learned not to think too far ahead. Some thought too far ahead no matter how hard they tried not to. The war did not feel the same to everyone in a convoy, even when they were moving down the same road at the same speed. There is also a practical truth worth noticing. Convoys were made up of individuals with different jobs and different experiences: drivers, gunners, truck commanders, medics, mechanics, convoy commanders, soldiers assigned to escort duties, and civilians attached to logistics operations could all be part of the movement. One Army article from December 2011, describing a National Guard escort team on its final convoy out of Iraq, explained that the unit's work involved picking up logistics supplies and escorting them from one base to another. That description is useful because it brings the subject down to scale. Convoy duty was not only about dramatic engagements. Much of it was about making sure ordinary military life continued somewhere else, because the right supplies arrived at the right place. And this is where the road becomes more than a road. On a map, it is a line between points. On a convoy mission, it is a sequence of possible decisions: how fast to move, whether to close a gap, whether a vehicle ahead is behaving strangely, whether the roadside looks different than it did last time, whether the crowd near an intersection is simply a crowd or something that deserves more attention, whether the pause in civilian traffic is coincidence or warning, whether the object near the curb was there yesterday, whether the convoy is seeing too much, too little, or exactly what it needs to see. That kind of attention is tiring. It can be tiring even before anything happens. Especially before anything happens. The Iraq War is often remembered through its largest events. The initial invasion in 2003, the fall of Baghdad, the rise of the insurgency, the sectarian violence of the mid-2000s, the surge, the transition from Operation Iraqi Freedom to Operation New Dawn in 2010, the withdrawal in 2011, all of those matter. But between those large events were countless smaller movements that rarely become the focus of public memory. Vehicles rolling through the dark, fuel tankers moving under escort, troops watching road shoulders, mechanics hoping the truck holds until the next stop, a convoy pushing through exhaustion because the schedule has already slipped. These journeys did not always produce headlines, but they were part of the structure that held the entire war effort together. There is a tendency to imagine modern war as distant and technical. Satellites overhead, drones in the sky, radios, sensors, screens, systems, acronyms, all of that existed. Yet convoy riding brought war back down to a human scale. It was still a person looking through a windshield, a person gripping a steering wheel, a person turning their head toward a roadside shape because something about it felt wrong, a person listening for a call over the radio, a person mentally marking the time since the last stop, the remaining distance, the pace of the vehicles ahead. Technology shaped the experience, but it did not remove the need for human attention. In some ways, it demanded more of it. As the war went on, the vehicles changed because the danger changed. Early in the conflict, many convoys relied heavily on Humvees and gun trucks, with armour improvised or added as the threat developed. Later, MRAPs became one of the most visible responses to the IED problem, designed to offer better protection against blasts from below. They did not erase the risk, and no one inside them believed they made the road safe, but their arrival reflected how seriously the convoy threat had been taken by the middle years of the war. The urgency of that shift is clear in official acquisition records and army transportation histories from the period. Still, even the strongest vehicle did not turn a convoy into an ordinary commute. Weight, armour, heat, noise, limited visibility, long hours, and the physical tension of staying alert created a kind of fatigue that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. The inside of a military vehicle in Iraq could feel both protected and confining. Protected because of the metal, the glass, the gear, the people beside you. confining because once the convoy was moving, the world outside arrived in fragments. A wall, a shop front, a child near the road, a car slowing, a burst of dust, a traffic circle, a canal, a roadside stand. The brain tried to sort it all quickly because the convoy did not stop, so each detail could be considered at leisure. It is worth thinking about what made convoy duty so psychologically particular. Infantry patrols, raids, and direct combat missions carried their own forms of fear and concentration. Convoys had a different rhythm. They required movement through space that could not be fully controlled. They passed through Iraqi towns, open roads, industrial areas, bridges, farmland, urban streets, and stretches of desert where emptiness could feel no less demanding than a crowd. The threat might come suddenly, but often it existed first as anticipation. People inside the convoy lived in that anticipation for hours. The waiting was part of the work. Some convoys left in darkness, some returned in darkness. Darkness could conceal a vehicle. It could also complicate the road. Lights had to be managed. Visibility narrowed. The world outside seemed closer and more distant at the same time. In December 2011, when the last major troop movement out of Iraq crossed toward Kuwait, the final convoy began in darkness, included more than 100 vehicles and 500 soldiers, and reached the border as dawn approached. That was the closing image of an era of American military road movement in Iraq, but it also resembled countless earlier departures on a smaller scale. Start before first light, roll out under caution, trust the people around you, keep moving. That final convoy in 2011 is often remembered because it marked an ending, but for this story it is more useful as a reminder of how much of the war passed along roads. From the early advance northward in 2003 to the long years of resupply, escort missions, route security and eventual withdrawal, the convoy was one of the ordinary mechanisms through which the war was lived. Not by generals alone, not only by combat arms units in headline-making battles, but by the men and women who spent deployment after deployment learning what it meant to travel through a place where the journey itself could be the dangerous part. And if you have ever taken an easy drive late at night, watched lane markers pass beneath the headlights, and allowed your mind to wander because the road felt predictable, then it may be hard at first to place yourself inside this world. In a convoy during the Iraq War, the road did not allow wandering. It asked for attention, it asked for restraint, it asked for patience, it asked people to continue forward, even when the body wanted to tense, and even when experience had taught them that the next ordinary-looking moment might not stay ordinary. So let us stay there a little longer. The vehicles are lined up, the engines are idling, the sky has not fully brightened. Someone gives the final signal. The gate ahead will open soon, and the convoy will begin to move. But before that first vehicle rolls out, there is still the matter of preparation. What people checked, what they carried, what they told themselves, and what it felt like to wait in armour for the road to begin. The vehicles have not moved yet, but the mission has already begun. That is one of the first things to understand about convoy travel in Iraq. The danger did not start at the gate, and the work did not begin when the tyres crossed from the base road onto the public highway. It started earlier, in the hours before departure, when people checked the same equipment again and again, listened to information they had heard in some form before, studied a route they might already know by memory, and tried to prepare themselves for a trip that could remain uneventful from beginning to end or change in a few seconds. The staging area before a convoy rolled out was not quiet in the ordinary sense, but it could feel strangely contained. Engines idled, radios were tested, metal doors opened and shut, boots struck pavement, gravel, or packed earth. Someone moved from vehicle to vehicle with a clipboard or a roster. Someone else leaned into a cab to confirm a detail that had already been confirmed once. The air smelled like diesel, dust, hot machinery, and the stale remains of coffee that had been made too early and drunk too fast. Depending on the season and the hour, Iraq might still be cool before sunrise. or already warming in a way that promised an exhausting day. The heat became part of convoy life, but even before that heat settled in, there was the pressure of time. Every departure had a schedule, every truck had to be in order, every person had to be accounted for. If one piece of the movement lagged, the whole line felt it. A military convoy in Iraq was a careful arrangement rather than a collection of vehicles that happened to leave together. There was a planned sequence, a lead element, security vehicles, cargo vehicles, recovery capability, and a trail position that carried its own responsibilities. The exact composition changed from mission to mission and across the years of the war, but the basic principle held. The convoy was organised to move, defend itself, communicate, recover from breakdowns, and continue if it could. Army logistics writing from the Iraq period treated these patrols as combat missions, not ordinary transportation jobs, and the preparation before departure reflected that. Some of the preparation happened the evening before. A mission brief might bring together everyone who needed to understand the next day's movement, including drivers, gunners, passengers, and leaders. In one Army logistics account from 2009, a convoy briefing was held the night before departure to give the group a threat assessment, mission, scheme of manoeuvre, coordinating instructions, and a whiteboard rehearsal for the next morning's movement. That description is useful because it shows how little was left to chance. People were not simply told, "We leave at dawn." They were told what route they would use, what threats had been reported, how the vehicles would move, what to do if they made contact, how to react if a vehicle became disabled, and what the convoy commander expected if the plan began to unravel. There is something deeply practical about a whiteboard rehearsal. It is not cinematic. It does not look impressive from the outside. A few rough lines, vehicle symbols, arrows, circles, shorthand labels, perhaps a hand moving along the drawn route as the leader explains where the convoy will slow, where it might change formation, where a choke point could create problems. Yet this kind of rehearsal mattered because once a convoy was moving, there was no time for a leisurely discussion. The driver needed to know where to go. The truck commander needed to understand the overall plan. The gunner needed to know what kind of area they were approaching. The convoy commander needed to trust that everyone had heard the same instructions. Rehearsal could not make the route safe, but it could reduce confusion, and confusion was dangerous in a moving column of heavily loaded vehicles. By the morning of departure, the larger plan gave way to smaller checks. The US Army used the language of pre-combat checks and pre-combat inspections, PCCs and PCEs, terms that sound bureaucratic until you understand what they meant on a convoy line. These were not casual glances. They were the process of confirming that people, weapons, vehicles, radios, protective gear, ammunition, and mission essentials were ready before movement. In one logistics article describing convoy preparation, units conducted pre-combat checks, inspections and communications checks 2 hours before the start point. Another Army account emphasised that convoy units in Iraq were training specifically to tighten up those same PCCs and PCIs because they were essential before going out on mission. A driver might begin with the vehicle itself, fuel, tyres, oil, fluid levels, lights if they would be needed, brakes, doors, mirrors, load security, anything strapped to the outside, anything stowed inside. There was always a temptation, especially on a route driven many times, to move quickly through what seemed familiar. But familiarity could become carelessness. A loose strap on a load could matter, a radio problem could matter, a hatch that did not work properly could matter. A vehicle that looked fine in the motor pool and failed 30 miles later could slow or expose an entire convoy. That is why the repetition existed, It was not because soldiers enjoyed checking the same things twice. It was because a small failure after departure could create the kind of situation everyone was trying to avoid. The gunners had their own work. Mounted weapons had to be checked. Ammunition had to be accessible. Fields of movement had to be considered. The turret area, where applicable, had to be ready for hours of scanning. Gunners were not climbing into a comfortable seat with a broad view and a breeze. They were climbing into a physically demanding position that could become exhausting, especially under sun and dust, and that required focus from the first mile onward. Official army descriptions of pre-mission activity repeatedly note gunners climbing into turrets and mounting crew-served weapons as part of the final readiness sequence. Radios mattered just as much. A convoy could not function as a single body if its vehicles could not talk to one another. Before departure, communication checks confirmed that the necessary systems worked, that voices were coming through, that call signs were understood, and that the people who would need to speak under pressure could be heard. Army convoy preparation documents from the period place communication checks, alongside pre-combat inspections, not afterthoughts, because a vehicle that could not communicate might become isolated even while driving in a line with everyone else. Satellite-based convoy monitoring systems were also used in Iraq to track logistics patrols beyond ordinary radio range, which reflects how seriously the military treated the problem of knowing where its moving convoys were. The people going out also checked themselves, though that part was less formal in appearance. Body armour adjusted, helmet straps sorted, gloves found, eye protection cleaned, water packed, weapons checked and checked again. Personal items placed where they could be reached but would not become clutter. A pen, a small notebook, perhaps a folded piece of paper with route notes or frequencies, depending on the person's role. The larger purpose was readiness, but the smaller truth was that people were trying to make themselves feel a little more prepared than they actually felt. There is comfort in checking something with your hands. It gives the mind a task. It delays the moment when the task becomes waiting, and waiting was part of it. Convoys did not always leave the instant everyone felt ready. A timeline had to hold. Another element might still be forming. Intelligence might be updated. A change in cargo could force a small adjustment. A vehicle could develop a problem at precisely the worst time, which is to say, just before departure, when every other vehicle seems ready and every person can feel the delay accumulating. In one army logistics model, there was even a designated convoy update brief 30 minutes before the start point, allowing the commander to give final information and intelligence updates close to departure. That small detail tells you something important. The route was never treated as completely known. Conditions could change between the night brief and the morning departure. The update brief might include a report of recent activity along a route, construction, known congestion, a damaged bridge, or intelligence about possible threats. Not every item would come true. Not every warning would matter. But they all entered the minds of the people listening. A route with a recently reported attack felt different from a route without one. A neighbourhood that had been quiet but now appeared in a threat update felt different. A bridge or overpass mentioned in the brief became something to remember later. This is how preparation changed perception. This same road looked different after someone told you what might happen on it. It is worth pausing here because this pre-departure moment could be misleading from the outside. Someone watching from a distance might think the convoy area looked routine. People moving around, trucks idling, a leader talking, a few soldiers laughing at something, a gunner adjusting gear. Nothing obviously dramatic. But ordinary appearance does not mean ordinary feeling. In many high-risk jobs, the last moments before action look almost disappointingly plain. The body has not yet been forced into alarm, so it stays in the familiar motions of work. That is true in a hospital before a difficult procedure, on a ship before rough weather, and in a convoy staging area before the gate opens. The task is not yet happening, but everyone knows it is about to. Some soldiers like to joke before departure. Humour appears often in accounts of dangerous work because it gives people a way to breathe without saying they are nervous. The joke might be about the food, the schedule, the route, the truck, the weight of the gear, or the fact that no one had slept enough. It might not even be funny. That was beside the point. Laughter, even thin laughter, helps keep the waiting from becoming too serious too soon. Others withdrew into silence. They found a place to sit if one existed, or leaned against a vehicle, or stood with their hands resting on equipment they had already inspected. There was no single way to wait. Some people became louder, some became quieter. Both responses belonged to the same condition. The convoy commander occupied a particular space in this preparation. That person had to hold the mission in full while everyone else held a piece of it. The commander was concerned with the route, the order of movement, timing, communications, the threat picture, coordination with others, the recovery plan, and the knowledge that if something went wrong on the road, decisions would be demanded quickly. Logistics doctrine from Iraq-era writing emphasized that convoy missions had special intelligence needs because of their geographic span and defensive character. In other words, these were not missions that took place in one fixed position. They stretched across territory over time through changing local conditions, and that made preparation unusually important. The convoy commander's confidence could influence everyone else. If the leader seemed composed, the group might feel steadier. If the leader seemed distracted or rushed, people noticed. That does not mean calm leaders were never afraid. It means they understood that before a convoy left, the tone of command became part of the equipment everyone carried. Instructions had to be clear. Questions had to be answered without turning the staging area into a seminar. The mission brief had to be serious without becoming theatrical. Everyone needed enough information to act, but not so much that the road became overwhelming before they even reached it. There were also passengers on some convoys, and their experience before departure could be different. They might not have been part of the same crew rhythms as the drivers and gunners. They could be soldiers moving to another base, specialists needed elsewhere, or personnel attached to the logistics movement for a specific reason. A 2009 logistics account notes that briefings included passengers, which matters because anyone riding in the convoy needed at least a basic understanding of what to do if the movement came under attack, or had to halt unexpectedly. A convoy was not a bus service, even when it was carrying people from one place to another. Contractor vehicles and coalition or Iraqi partners could add further complexity. Convoys in Iraq were not always made up solely of one unit's military vehicles. Army sustainment writing from 2010 described coalition forces, Iraqi security forces, and contractor members attending joint threat briefs and convoy mission briefs before conducting a ground rehearsal together. That tells us that pre-departure preparation could also be a process of making different organizations function as one moving group, despite differences in training, equipment, and routine. A ground rehearsal is one of those details that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Imagine people standing outside vehicles and physically walking through what they will do if the convoy is attacked, if it takes fire, if a truck breaks down, if it reaches the destination, if it encounters a hazard, if it needs to recover a damaged vehicle. This could feel repetitive to someone who had done it many times. It could also save time later when time was precious. Army convoy training materials from the period treated rehearsals as part of proper preparation, not optional extra work. And still, no matter how carefully the group prepared, the gate remained a line of its own. Inside the base, there was structure. There were walls, guard towers, checkpoints, known traffic patterns, and the dense familiarity of a place inhabited by the same people day after day. Outside the gate was the route. The moment of crossing was so ordinary in physical terms that it almost seems inadequate. A vehicle rolls forward. A guard signals. The first truck exits. The next follows. Yet people remembered that transition because it separated two states of mind. On one side, you were preparing. On the other, you were executing. Before that happened, there was often one final round of small rituals. A driver tugged at a strap one more time. A gunner tested a movement one more time. A truck commander checked the radio again, even though it had already worked. Someone said, "You good?" and received the expected answer whether or not the answer was complete. Someone settled into a seat and made the last adjustment possible before the convoy began rolling. There was no ceremony in most of it, no speech worthy of a film, just the practical mechanics of leaving a protected place for a route that demanded attention. This is where modern memory sometimes fails to capture the experience. Public discussion of the Iraq War tends to gather around large policy decisions, famous battles, casualty figures, elections, scandals, and withdrawal dates. Those are important. But for the people who rode convoys, the war also lived in these smaller repetitions. The brief at night, the armour in the morning, the communication check, the map review, the stale coffee, the waiting, the final update, the gate. History often moves quickly from event to event, but people do not experience time that way. They spend long stretches in preparation, and those stretches shape how everything afterward feels. One of the most difficult truths about convoy preparation is that it had to produce readiness without producing paralysis. Too little caution could get people hurt. Too much fixation on danger could wear people down before the mission began. The balance was never perfect. A convoy team had to accept that they could check the vehicle, rehearse the contact drill, review the route, confirm the radio, tighten the straps, inspect the armour, and still not know what waited beyond the gate. That uncertainty was not a failure of preparation. It was part of the job. You can feel the tension in the routines the army documented, the pre-combat inspection, the threat brief, the route-focused intelligence, the communications check, the convoy update brief, the ground rehearsal. These are practical steps, but taken together they reveal the emotional shape of the morning. Everyone is trying to move from uncertainty into procedure, from possibility into task. Procedure does not eliminate fear. It gives fear something to stand beside. Then, at last, the order comes down. Mount up. Final checks. Move to the start point. The line begins to settle into itself. Doors close. Voices become sharper on the radio and less casual inside the vehicles. The convoy that had been spread across a staging area begins to form into its proper order. From outside it may look slow, heavy, even clumsy as one vehicle follows another into position. From inside, it feels different. Every adjustment of the brake, every roll of the tyres, every call over the radio is the beginning of the mission taking hold. The gate is ahead now. The base is still behind them. The road has not yet begun to pass beneath the wheels, but it is close enough that the mind is already out there. A driver looks forward. A gunner begins scanning more deliberately. The convoy commander listens. The people riding in the back settle their bodies into the awkward arrangement they will maintain for however long the movement lasts. Dust lifts behind the first vehicle. The line tightens. The last moments of waiting disappear, and the convoy starts to leave the safety of the wire behind. Once the gate opened, the work changed. Preparation gave way to motion. The briefed route became an actual road with actual traffic, actual buildings, actual shadows, and actual places where every person inside the convoy had to decide what deserved attention. And inside the vehicles, beneath armour, gear, and engine noise, the experience of the ride itself began to take shape. Once the vehicle started moving, the world narrowed very quickly. A convoy might stretch across a roadway in a long visible line, but for the people inside it, the experience became immediate and close. The vehicle around them. The person seated beside them, the radio in their ear, the view through thick glass, the weight of gear pressing against the chest and shoulders, the engine rising and settling as the driver moved with the vehicles ahead. Before the convoy entered the open road, before anyone began studying culverts and overpasses and parked cars, there was first the simple fact of being inside a war vehicle that had been turned into both transportation and shelter. For many American troops in Iraq, especially in the earlier years of the war, that vehicle was a Humvee. The high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle had been designed as a versatile military utility vehicle, but the insurgency in Iraq forced it into roles and conditions that placed far greater demands on protection. In the summer of 2003, according to an army acquisition publication, there were fewer than 250 up-armoured Humvees in Operation Iraqi Freedom. By late 2004, production had accelerated sharply, with more than 5,600 M1114 up-armoured Humvees manufactured toward a theatre requirement of roughly 8,100. That shift is important because it tells us something about what convoy riders experienced over time. The vehicle interiors of 2003 were not always the same as those of 2005 or 2007. Protection increased because the threat increased, and the vehicle changed around the people riding in it. Early in the war, before standardized protection reached everyone who needed it, soldiers improvised. Army Transportation Corps histories of convoy fighting in Iraq describe crews hanging old Kevlar vests over vehicle doors for added protection, while other gun trucks had ballistic armour and ballistic glass. These were not small cosmetic changes. They reflected a moment when the roads were becoming more dangerous faster than the equipment system could respond. A vehicle that had once been understood mainly as transport was being treated as something that might have to absorb gunfire, fragments, or worse. The men and women riding in it understood that transformation physically. They saw it in the plates bolted onto doors, in the thickened windows, in the reduced visibility, and in the feeling that every layer of protection also made the cabin more enclosed. An up-armoured Humvee was not roomy. Soldiers who trained in Humvee rollover simulators before deployment described the interior as cramped, with little room to manoeuvre, especially when body armour and combat gear were added. That crampedness mattered in ordinary movement, not only in emergencies. A person might sit with a weapon between the knees or angled carefully to avoid interfering with someone else. Knees pressed near equipment, shoulders touched. The door was closed, the ceiling was close. The centre console, radios, weapons, bags and other gear all claimed space. The vehicle did not feel like a car in which people happened to wear military equipment. It felt like a small compartment built from metal, glass, cables and necessity. Body armour changed the ride as much as the vehicle did. A vest that felt manageable while standing became harder to ignore when worn for hours in a seat. The plates pushed against the torso, shoulder straps rubbed. A helmet altered the way someone leaned back, or did not lean back. The rifle or carbine had to remain accessible without becoming a hazard in the cramped space. Everyone inside knew there was a reason for the equipment. No one wanted less protection. But wanting protection and enjoying the physical experience of carrying it were different things. A convoy ride asked a person to accept discomfort as part of staying alive. The windows made their own contribution to that feeling. Ballistic glass protected against small arms fire and fragments. But it also changed the relationship between the rider and the world outside. The view could be narrower, the glass was thick. Depending on the condition of the window, dust, scratches, glare and reflections could all interfere with sight. To ride in a convoy was not simply to look out at a wreck, it was to study a wreck through armour. Roadsides, storefronts, passing cars, children waving, men standing near walls, trash heaps, barriers, market stalls, canals, bridges and fields all appear through a layer that reminded you why it was there. The glass protected, but it also separated. That separation was one of the defining sensations of armoured movement. Inside, communication competed with machinery. Engines were loud. Tyres struck uneven pavement. Gear rattled. Fans and air conditioning units, when they worked, added another layer of sound. Radios cut through it all with bursts of voices that every person learned to recognise differently. Some calls were routine, vehicle spacing, a turn ahead, a change in speed, a check that the trail vehicle was still with the convoy. Others carried a subtle shift in tone that made people sit straighter. Anyone who has spent time around radios knows that urgency can appear before the words themselves fully register. A clipped call, a repeated phrase, a pause before a response. Inside the vehicle, people listened not only for information, but for changes in the emotional temperature of the net. That term, temperature, was not merely figurative in Iraq. Heat inside armoured vehicles was a serious operational concern. Army mechanics in Iraq noted in 2007 that Humvees without working air conditioning were deadlined, meaning they were not considered mission capable because of the extra heat and equipment inside them. In 2009, another Army maintenance article explained that leaving outside air vents open could clog Humvee air conditioning systems with dust and reduce airflow. These are small technical details, but together they point to a larger reality. The interior of an armoured vehicle in Iraq could become punishingly hot, and cooling systems were not a luxury item. They mattered to endurance, alertness, and basic functionality. There were efforts to mitigate that heat. An Army logistics publication from 2006 described cooling vests used by soldiers riding in specially equipped Humvees, with chilled water circulated by the vehicle's air conditioning system. That detail tells us how difficult the problem could become. It was not simply that the weather was hot. Iraq's climate pressed against a vehicle already burdened by armour, equipment, and bodies. The cabin held heat. Gear trapped heat against the skin. A mission could last for hours. Soldiers needed to remain watchful while their bodies were working against exhaustion. A convoy ride might appear still from the outside, but inside it could be physically draining before anything had happened. The driver had a different relationship to the vehicle than anyone else. Other people rode inside it. The driver managed it. On a convoy mission, driving was not a passive act. The driver tracked the vehicle ahead, maintained the required spacing, watched for sudden braking, watched the road surface, listened to the truck commander, absorbed radio traffic when relevant, and stayed ready to react without making abrupt movements that could endanger the vehicle behind. The armour made many vehicles heavier than their earlier configurations. Army acquisition and upgrade reporting from the period repeatedly described added armour kits and additional weight, including MRAP armour packages that could add thousands of pounds. Weight changed acceleration, braking, handling, and the consequences of a bad turn. The driver did not need to recite those figures. The driver felt them every time the vehicle moved. A truck commander or vehicle commander in the passenger seat worked beside the driver but carried a wider burden. That person might navigate, communicate, monitor the convoy, watch the sides of the road, and help interpret what was unfolding ahead. The exact division of tasks depended on the unit and the vehicle, but the pattern was familiar. The driver kept the vehicle under control, while the commander helped keep the vehicle inside the mission. In a normal civilian drive, two people in the front seat can drift into conversation. In a convoy, casual talk might happen during quieter stretches, but both front seat positions were always waiting for something to require their attention. The gunner lived in yet another version of the same journey. In many convoy vehicles during the Iraq War, especially before remotely operated weapon stations became more common, the gunner stood in the turret, exposed above the roofline to varying degrees while operating a mounted weapon. The gunner's view was better than anyone else's. That was the point. A gunner could scan ahead to the sides and over obstacles that limited the sight line of those inside. But that better view came with physical strain and danger. Sun, wind, dust, road vibration, and the awareness of exposure all belonged to that position. Army reporting and imagery throughout the Iraq period repeatedly showed turret gunners as central to convoy security because they were the eyes and immediate defensive capability of the vehicle. The people seated inside might glance upward toward the gunner's boots or legs, hearing movement above them, knowing that the person in the turret was doing a job none of them could fully see from their own seats. A gunner leaning one way, then another, could send a small signal through the vehicle. Something had caught attention. Perhaps nothing came of it. Most scanned objects did not become threats, yet the motion mattered. Those inside learned to notice one another's adjustments. A convoy crew developed a silent awareness built from repetition, the driver easing off the accelerator, the commander lifting binoculars or turning more sharply toward the window, the gunner holding a sector a little longer than usual. These tiny movements communicated long before anyone spoke. By 2007 and 2008, another vehicle began reshaping convoy interiors in a major way: the Mine-Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle, or MRAP. The Department of Defense elevated MRAP procurement rapidly because improvised explosive devices had become one of the deadliest threats in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Government Accountability Office reported in 2008 that about 75% of casualties in then-current operations were attributed to IEDs, and the Secretary of Defense had designated MRAP the department's single most important acquisition program in May 2007. The Army fielded its 10,000th MRAP in Iraq by February 2009. Those dates matter because they mark a transition in what convoy riders increasingly saw around them and, for many, what they rode in. The MRAP was taller, heavier, and designed with blast protection in mind. Army articles from 2007 noted that MRAPs were being sent first to units operating in the highest threat areas. Later, Army descriptions of the vehicle's legacy emphasised that the early models delivered to theatre were large personnel carriers, often more than 10 feet tall and weighing more than 10 tons. From inside, an MRAP could feel more substantial than a Humvee, with a higher ride and a greater sense of mass. That did not mean its occupants relaxed. No vehicle made the road safe, but MRAPs embodied an institutional recognition that the threat from below, from roadside bombs and buried explosives, had become central to the convoy experience. The change from Humvee to MRAP was not simply a change in armour thickness. It changed how people entered, exited, sat, and thought about emergencies. Army reporting from 2009 described MRAP rollover trainers because the new vehicles created their own risks. Between November 1st, 2007 and March 31st, 2008, Army statistics recorded 119 non-hostile MRAP rollover incidents in the military. The Army developed dedicated MRAP egress trainers so soldiers could practice escaping from an overturned cab. That concern belongs in this story because it reminds us that protection always carries trade-offs. A vehicle designed to survive blasts could still become dangerous if it rolled, and a large armoured cabin could become disorienting when turned upside down. This is why rollover training became vivid in the memories of many who underwent it. Soldiers were strapped into mock vehicle interiors, rotated, suspended, and made to find belts, doors, and exit paths while upside down. Humvee trainers existed for similar reasons. Army reporting in 2008 noted that by the end of 2006, nearly 125 soldier fatalities and 140 injuries had resulted from Humvee rollover accidents, which helped drive mandatory training. One article explained that the training module represented an up-armoured Humvee and was designed to simulate what it felt like to get out of a flipped vehicle. That training does not tell us what every convoy ride felt like, but it tells us what every convoy rider was being prepared to survive. The interior that offered protection during movement might become a trap in a different kind of emergency. Inside the vehicle, people carried that knowledge quietly. They knew where the belt release was. They knew the door might not open easily in every circumstance. They knew equipment could shift. They knew that in a blast or rollover, the simple act of getting out might become confusing. Most of the time, those thoughts stayed in the background. Humans cannot operate well if every possible disaster takes the front of the mind at once. But the training remained there, held in reserve, part of the mental inventory brought onto the road. Not all discomfort was dramatic. Some of it was simply the slow accumulation of small irritations, sweat gathering beneath body armour, the hard edge of a seat, a strap digging into the shoulder, a mouth that felt dry even after drinking water. Dust that found its way into spaces it seemed too fine to reach. Headsets pressing against the ears. A cramped foot position that became annoying after 20 minutes and painful after 2 hours. The body learned to make small adjustments where space allowed. Shift one knee, move a canteen. Reseat the weapon sling, push the helmet back a fraction, then return it to where it belonged. No single discomfort defined the ride. Together they shaped it. The mental work inside the vehicle was just as constant. A person sitting in the back might not have the driver's direct responsibilities, or the gunner's wider field of view, but that did not mean the mind rested. Passengers listened to the convoy net. They watched the limited slice of outside world available through the glass. They noticed when the vehicle slowed unexpectedly. They looked toward the front seats when the driver and commander became more focused. They prepared to follow instructions without delay. In some convoy settings, everyone inside was expected to remain ready to dismount, assist, secure, or respond depending on the mission. The vehicle was not a place to disengage from the convoy. It was a place to wait in readiness. And then there was the way armour affected the senses. Protection reduced exposure, but it also muted and altered information. A shouted sound from outside might not be heard clearly. The road noise inside might make it hard to distinguish one sharp impact from another. A person could see something before hearing it, or feel the vehicle react before understanding why. This mattered because convoy riding demanded interpretation. Was that sudden stop planned? Was that crack outside a harmless sound from the road or something else? Was the gunner shifting because of ordinary scanning or because a specific point had become suspicious? Inside armour, people were safer from many threats, but they also had to interpret a world arriving through barriers. The introduction of more equipment intensified that environment. Radios, communications gear, mounted systems and mission packages all needed space and power. A 2009 GAO testimony on MRAP acquisition explained that the government retained responsibility for final integration of radios and other mission equipment into vehicles before fielding. That bureaucratic phrase translates into a practical reality inside the cabin. Vehicles were increasingly more than engines and armour. They were communications nodes, tracking platforms, weapons mounts, and mobile workspaces all at once. Every additional capability helped the mission, and every additional device complicated the physical space around the occupants. Still, people adapted. That's one of the most striking things about the convoy experience. A space that might feel shocking to a newcomer became familiar to someone who rode it often. The awkward way to climb in with body armour. The place where the water bottle could be wedged without rolling. The angle that made it easier to look out one particular window. The sound the door made when closed properly. The exact motion needed to settle a weapon safely without tangling the sling. Repetition did not make the danger normal, but it made the physical environment known. The vehicle became a small personal map. Some crews personalised that space where they were allowed. Names painted on gun trucks appear in Army logistics coverage from Iraq. Music references, nicknames, dark humour, and signs of unit identity turned machinery into something a little less anonymous. The names did not lessen the danger, they did something else. They suggested ownership, familiarity, and a way of saying that this specific vehicle, not just any vehicle, belonged to the crew who would trust it on the road. It is easy, from a distance, to think of a convoy vehicle as one piece of military hardware among many. From inside, it became a whole environment. It carried temperature, smell, noise, routine, discomfort, communication, and fear in a tightly bounded space. It placed people close enough to sense one another's tension without discussing it. It allowed them to move through hostile or uncertain terrain while remaining partly enclosed, partly exposed, and never fully detached from the road. The metal mattered. The glass mattered. The armour mattered. But so did the way hands rested, the way heads turned, the way a person listened to the radio when the voice at the other end changed slightly. As the convoy continued forward, the interior slowly stopped being the main object of awareness. It was still there, pressing against every movement, but attention began shifting outward. The first secured stretches near the base gave way to public roadways. Civilian traffic appeared. Buildings edged closer. The visible world outside the armoured windows became more varied, and therefore more demanding. The people inside adjusted without announcing it. Drivers settled into convoy speed. Commanders watched farther ahead. Gunners widened their scan. The ride beneath the armour had begun, and now the road itself was starting to make its presence known. The gate did not look especially dramatic. That is worth saying at the beginning, because the moment itself could be physically small, even when it felt enormous. A barrier lifted. A guard signalled. The led vehicle rolled forward. The rest of the convoy began to move in sequence. Dust rose from the tyres and hung briefly in the artificial light or the weak early sun. Behind them were concrete walls, HESCO barriers, guard towers, entry control points, and the familiar clutter of a base that had become a temporary world of its own. Ahead of them was Iraq beyond the perimeter, the road system that connected camps, airfields, supply hubs, cities, patrol bases, and places that looked ordinary until someone briefed them as dangerous. Leaving the wire was not an explosion of action. It was a crossing. 1 second the convoy was inside a place built to protect it. The next second it was outside, and every person in every vehicle understood that the rules had changed. By 2006, major logistics commands in Iraq had determined that military and contractor vehicles operating outside forward operating bases had to be armoured, which says plainly how seriously that shift from inside to outside was taken. There was a reason soldiers and drivers remembered the phrase outside the wire so clearly. It did not refer only to distance. It described a mental state. Inside the base, movement happened under layers of control. Roads were familiar. Vehicles passed through known checkpoints. Security belonged to the perimeter, the guard force, the towers, the walls. Outside, security had to move with the convoy. The vehicles carried it themselves through armour, weapons, spacing, radios, rehearsed actions and constant observation. A convoy might leave a large installation such as Camp Victory, Ballard, Taji, Scania, or a smaller forward operating base farther north or west, but the experience shared a common quality. The familiar perimeter fell away behind them, and the outside world began offering information faster than anyone could fully process it. The first few minutes mattered, not because every attack occurred immediately after departure, but because the convoy had to settle into movement while the crew's attention was sharpening. The lead vehicles established the pace, drivers began matching distance, trail vehicles ensured the rear of the formation remained intact. Gunners lifted their focus beyond the gate and began working their sectors with more purpose. The truck commanders or vehicle commanders watched the road and the movement ahead. The convoy commander listened to the radio net and monitored how smoothly the line was forming. Every part of the convoy was transitioning from assembly to operation. The base road might still be visible in mirrors, a tower might still be behind them, yet the mission had already become live. Some units tried to make this transition as deliberate as possible. One army article describing a battalion in Iraq noted that all patrols and convoys leaving the wire completed checklists, and that patrol leaders had to verify that pre-combat checks, pre-combat inspections, briefs, and selected battle drills had been conducted before departure. The point was not paperwork for its own sake. It was a way to fight complacency, especially when a route had been driven many times. The first time outside the wire and the 200th time required preparation, because the road did not care how familiar the crew had become with it. Once the convoy cleared the immediate gate area, the road began its work on the senses. The first visible change was usually civilian life. Iraqi cars, small trucks, taxis, buses, pedestrians near the roadside, shop fronts in built-up areas. Men gathered beside walls or storefronts. Children looking at the passing vehicles, sometimes waving, sometimes simply watching. Livestock near open ground. Concrete barriers, traffic circles, canals, overpasses, narrow turns, damaged pavement, half-finished buildings, and piles of debris that might be meaningless or might deserve a second look. The convoy entered a world that belonged to people who lived there, and at the same time it had to move through that world as if danger could be concealed inside any part of it. That tension followed every convoy mile after mile. In the earlier and more violent years of the war, coalition convoys often moved with practices designed to preserve distance from civilian traffic. Army sustainment writing later described convoys driving down the centre of the road, forcing oncoming traffic to stop, setting up hasty traffic control points during turns, keeping civilian vehicles hundreds of feet away in a protective bubble, and posting signs warning others to stay back. Those practices were meant to reduce risk to the convoy, especially during years when roadside bombs, vehicle-borne threats and ambushes were major concerns. In October 2008, after security conditions had improved in many areas, Multinational Corps Iraq introduced the Share the Road initiative, which reduced some of those measures, allowed civilian vehicles to mingle more closely with convoys, and encouraged more night movement in order to ease congestion. The fact that such a policy change became necessary shows how forcefully convoys had occupied Iraqi roads during the height of the conflict. But for the convoy rider during much of the war, especially in the middle years, the first road beyond the gate could feel unsettled even when it was calm. People knew that gates and nearby approaches were not automatically safe. In April 2004, during a period of widespread attacks on transportation units, one convoy ambush occurred only about a mile from the gate at Baghdad International Airport. Other convoys moving into and out of that area were also attacked during the same uprising. That is the kind of detail that shaped behaviour. No one assumed danger waited politely 10 miles down the road. The dangerous stretch could begin almost immediately. So people looked hard. They watched vehicles that appeared to be closing distance too quickly. They studied lowered windows, sudden lane changes, a car stopping where no stop seemed necessary. They noticed whether a traffic pattern felt normal or had thinned oddly. They scanned road shoulders, ditches, curbs, culverts, and the base of walls. Army writing from the period described convoy occupants continuously scanning their side of the road for lowered windows from which insurgents might fire, or for anything that looked out of place. That phrase, out of place, mattered more than any checklist could fully explain. Convoy riding demanded that people build a working sense of what belonged in the environment and what did not. It was an imperfect skill, learned under pressure. The problem was that Iraq outside the wire was full of things that looked uncertain, even when they were harmless. Trash accumulated along roadsides. Construction materials lay in piles. Disabled vehicles sat where they had been abandoned or left temporarily. Irrigation channels cut through fields. Earth near the edge of the pavement could be disturbed for reasons that had nothing to do with explosives. Children ran across roads. Civilian cars drifted unpredictably. Animals wandered. Markets crowded close to traffic. Any one of those things could demand attention. Most meant nothing. The difficulty lay in never knowing which detail deserved the most concern until after the moment had passed. This is why leaving the wire was tiring from the beginning. The convoy had not yet reached the most infamous stretches of road. It might still be near a base where patrols and security forces operated constantly. Even so, every mind inside the convoy had to move from preparation into interpretation. A person sitting in the passenger seat was no longer simply recalling the brief. They were comparing the brief to the actual road. A gunner was no longer standing above a stationary vehicle in a staging area. They were scanning a moving landscape where perspective changed every second. The driver was no longer waiting for a signal. They were controlling a heavy vehicle in formation while trying to remain aware of something as basic as brake lights ahead and something as serious as a possible threat beside the lane. The gate also marked a change in how the convoy occupied time. Inside the base, seconds before departure could stretch. Outside, time was measured differently. The convoy moved through checkpoints, intersections, and known danger areas one after another. Someone might watch the mileage. Someone might mentally mark a canal crossing, a bridge, a turn near a fuel station, a narrow area where civilian traffic frequently stalled. Each landmark took them farther from the perimeter and deeper into the mission. The The convoy was not wandering. It had a schedule, a destination, and a route that had been selected for reasons. But the feeling from inside could still be that of entering a long corridor, where every segment had to be managed on its own terms. There was often a brief adjustment in conversation once the wire was behind them. Inside the base, people might have joked, complained, or spoken casually. After departure, talk usually thinned. It did not vanish entirely. Some crews still exchanged short comments. Someone might call out a vehicle moving oddly. Someone might ask for confirmation on a turn. Someone might say something ordinary simply because silence had become too noticeable. But the atmosphere shifted. The road became the main subject, whether anyone named it or not. The sound of the radio mattered more. The gunner's movements mattered more. The driver's braking mattered more. The convoy began listening to itself. Not everyone outside the gate had the same role in the larger mission, and that also shaped what leaving the wire meant. A combat logistics patrol hauling supplies out of a forward base carried a different immediate purpose than a mounted patrol moving into a city district, but both left behind the protected perimeter and entered a less predictable space. A sustainment unit in Iraq described building a convoy briefing room covered with overhead imagery of bridges, major intersections, patrol bases, and forward operating bases, because those details mattered to logistics missions moving across the battle space. The route itself had to be studied. The places between bases were not empty, they were operational terrain. For a driver or gunner who had done this many times, leaving the wire could become a habit, but not a casual one. There's a difference between being familiar with a ritual and becoming relaxed about it. The body might know how to settle into the seat, how to brace on a rough road, how to angle the rifle, how to keep the eyes moving. Yet the mind still registered the moment the convoy crossed out. Some veterans later described outside the wire missions in Iraq as the place where deployment felt most real, because it was there that the relative order of the base gave way to uncertainty. The base could have mortar alarms, shortages, dust storms, exhaustion, and all the other burdens of deployment. But it still had boundaries. The road did not. The convoy did not leave the wire as a single block of emotion. Some people felt a brief surge of adrenaline. Some became more focused and less expressive. Some were calm because repetition had trained them to be calm, or at least to appear that way. Others felt the old tightness in the stomach that came every time, even after dozens of trips. A person could believe in the preparation, trust the vehicle, trust the team, and still dislike the first 5 minutes outside the gate. Those reactions did not mean someone lacked courage. They meant they understood the environment. The earliest departures of the war had carried a different mood from later ones. During the invasion phase of 2003, convoys were part of a fast-moving campaign in which military columns pushed north and supply lines struggled to keep pace. By the insurgency years that followed, especially from 2004 onward, convoy movement became inseparable from the threat of ambush and improvised explosive devices. The Army Transportation Corps later described the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as a period when transportation soldiers became frontline soldiers on the roads, and when gun trucks and convoy security doctrine re-emerged as central features of war. That institutional assessment matters because it confirms what convoy crews felt in practice. Once the wire was behind them, they were not merely supporting the war. They were moving through one of its most dangerous spaces. Even the road immediately beyond a gate could teach lessons. If traffic built up there, the convoy had to manage separation while navigating civilian vehicles whose drivers might be impatient, curious, frightened, or simply trying to get to work. If the exit route forced a turn, a slowdown, or a merge, the convoy became momentarily less fluid. In a moving column, slowing is never just slowing. It changes spacing. It changes sight lines. It gives more time to anyone watching from nearby. It makes the convoy feel more exposed. This is why certain bends, overpasses, intersections and gate approaches appeared repeatedly in briefings and debriefings. They were places where the clean line of movement had to compress or hesitate. The led vehicle carried a particular responsibility during these opening minutes. It was establishing the convoy's first interaction with the road. The driver had to set a sustainable pace. The vehicle commander had to confirm the route. The gunner was often first to see how traffic ahead was behaving. If there was a blockage, a suspicious vehicle, or simply a slow-moving civilian car in the wrong position, the lead element encountered it first. Behind them, the rest of the convoy depended on those first judgments. A convoy did not think with one brain, but the front of the convoy often became the first part of the body to feel contact with the environment. The rear vehicle carried a different pressure. Leaving the gate, the convoy could appear to disappear gradually into the road, but it was not truly gone until the final vehicle had passed through, and the trail position had begun its own movement into the outside world. The rear watched for stragglers, spacing problems, vehicles trying to cut in, and anything approaching from behind. On roads where civilian traffic mixed with the convoy, the trail element had to care about what came after them as much as what lay ahead. The convoy was always more vulnerable than its strongest vehicle. It was only as organised as its full length. There were moments when the convoy left the wire under a kind of false normalcy. The sky might be clear, the road might look ordinary, civilians might barely glance at the passing vehicles because they had seen them many times before. The convoy might move through the first miles without a single alarming radio call. That calm was real. It was not imagined. Many convoy missions did reach their destination without attack, but calm did not produce relaxation in the way it would on an ordinary drive. The absence of danger did not prove danger had gone. It only meant nothing had happened yet. This is one of the harder aspects of convoy history to communicate. War is often told through events, but convoy riding was shaped just as much by non-events. The car that did not approach, the bag that turned out to be trash, the bridge that passed without incident, the overpass where nothing happened this time, the empty shoulder that stayed empty. These moments accumulated. They made up most of the hours. They mattered because each one required attention and then released it. By the time a convoy had been on the road for a while, the crew could be tired from responding internally to things that never became visible to anyone outside the vehicle. Some commands tried to reduce uncertainty through route security, intelligence updates, and evolving tactics. Logistics formations reviewed attack trends, escalation of force incidents, and changes in convoy practices. They adjusted gun truck ratios, escort requirements, and the size of movement packages based on the threat. One 2006 Army logistics report stated that a major support command devoted nearly a quarter of its force to combat logistics patrol security missions and coordinated hundreds of escorted patrols on an average day. That is an enormous commitment of manpower, and it reflects how much attention the act of moving beyond the wire demanded. From the perspective of a single rider, though, all that institutional machinery condensed into very ordinary acts. Watch the left side, check the mirror, keep the gap. Listen to the radio. Do not fixate on one object so long that you miss the next one. Stay off the road edge if the route and traffic allow. Notice the bridge. Notice the stalled car. Notice the group of men near the wall. Notice the child who runs forward, then stops. Notice the dust plume in the distance. Notice whether anyone else in the vehicle has become noticeably still. Outside the wire, the convoy's own size could create a strange contrast. It was loud, armoured, armed and visible. It might include heavy trucks, gun trucks, armoured escort vehicles and equipment that made the movement unmistakable from a long distance. Yet visibility did not always feel like power to those inside. It could feel like being announced. The convoy had a destination, but anyone on the road could see that it was coming. The same heavy presence that helped deter attacks also made concealment impossible. There was no slipping quietly into the surrounding traffic in the way a single civilian car might. A convoy entered the road as an event. That visibility changed relations with the civilian world around it. Some Iraqis may have looked at the vehicles with indifference shaped by repetition, others with irritation, fear, curiosity, or anger. For convoy riders, there was rarely time to sort those reactions in detail. They saw faces briefly through glass, across distance, through dust. A child waving from beside the road might draw a small wave back from someone in the vehicle, depending on the crew and the moment. A man standing in a doorway might be scanned carefully because posture and attention mattered, even though he could simply be watching traffic. The convoy had to move through human neighbourhoods while treating its surroundings as potential threat space. That was one of the most uncomfortable contradictions of the war. A mission that began before dawn could place the convoy on roads while shops were opening and families were starting their day. A movement later in the evening could pass through villages under weak street lighting, shop signs, vehicle lamps, and the uneven dark between built-up areas. The experience of leaving the wire changed with the hour. At night, the gate lights seemed brighter behind them, and the dark beyond them arrived sooner. During daylight, the road offered more visual detail than anyone could fully use. Either way, the transition from base to road marked a narrowing of attention. The convoy's world became the lane ahead, the shoulders, the vehicles nearby, and the road features named in the briefing. The war also changed around the convoy as the years passed. By 2009 and 2010, as parts of Iraq became more stable and US forces adjusted their posture, some convoy practices became less aggressive in many areas. The share the road changes were not merely administrative. They changed what it felt like to leave a base and merge into the outside world. Civilian traffic could come closer. Convoys in some places moved more often at night. Soldiers had to adapt to operating with less separation, while still preserving their right to self-defense if a genuine threat emerged. Army sustainment officers noted that this required a significant shift in thinking for coalition forces. Yet even in those later years, the old memory of the road remained. A quieter route did not erase what crews remembered from earlier deployments. One 2009 Army account quoted National Guard platoon commander comparing conditions to his first Iraq deployment in 2004 and 2005, when he said they were bombed nearly every day and found roadside bombs repeatedly when outside the wire. By 2009, he believed things had improved significantly, but the comparison itself is revealing. Soldiers did not measure calm in abstract terms. They measured it against roads they had once travelled under very different conditions. That difference in years matters for this story. There was no single convoy experience for the entire Iraq War. A departure in 2003, when the war was still in its initial phase, did not feel identical to a departure in 2006 during the most dangerous insurgency years, and neither was the same as a departure in 2010 during the drawdown. Vehicles changed, rules changed, roads changed, Iraqi security forces changed, the threat changed, but the threshold remained. No matter the year, no matter the route, no matter the size of the base, leaving the wire meant passing from a place of relative control into a space where movement itself required discipline. The convoy kept going. The gate was now farther behind them, perhaps already out of sight. The first road segment had been absorbed. The crew had settled into the rhythm of rolling caution. The staging area, the final check, the raised barrier, all of it had become recent memory. Now the route stretched ahead in full, carrying the convoy into the part of the mission where the road no longer felt like a simple surface beneath the tyres. It felt occupied. It felt watched. It felt like something the convoy had to read correctly, 1 mile at a time. The farther the convoy moved from the gate, the more the road stopped feeling neutral. At first it was only pavement, lane markings, dust, traffic, and the ordinary movement of a country continuing with its day. But for the people inside the vehicles, every mile required interpretation. A roadside ditch was no longer only a ditch. A culvert was not only a drainage channel. A parked car was not automatically just a parked car. A pile of trash might be exactly what it appeared to be, or it might deserve a second look. A stretch of road that had felt busy on the last mission might feel strangely quiet today. The route had to be read constantly, and that reading became one of the defining experiences of convoy life during the Iraq War. The threat of improvised explosive devices, precision small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenades made convoys among the most dangerous missions for many support units, and the hotspots along Iraqi routes changed often enough that no road could be treated as permanently understood. This is difficult to explain to someone who has only known roads as places designed to remove thought from travel. Most roads in ordinary life are meant to make movement easy. You follow the signs, stay in your lane, keep a reasonable speed, and trust that the surface ahead will do what roads are supposed to do. In Iraq, especially from 2004 through the height of the insurgency years, that trust had been damaged. Convoy crews knew that insurgents used the road itself as part of the attack. The road was where supply movement became predictable. It was where large vehicles had to pass. It was where traffic compressed, where bridges narrowed the route, where overpasses created visual limits, and where roadside clutter made concealment possible. Army convoy guidance from 2006 observed that some stretches of Iraq's main supply routes had been hit by so many IEDs that they looked like moonscapes, and it emphasized that leaders needed to know likely enemy activity areas before moving through them. The people in the convoy were not simply looking for one kind of danger. They were watching for patterns. A suspicious object was one matter. A change in civilian behaviour was another. In one Army Transportation Corps account of an April 2004 convoy ambush, drivers noticed that Iraqi vehicles began swerving off the road and that there were fewer locals than expected before the convoy reached a particularly dangerous stretch known as IED Alley. The same account describes rocks and tyres placed in the roadway to slow the convoy, followed soon after by an attack. Those details stayed with military readers because they showed how danger could announce itself indirectly before a weapon was fired. The road gave warnings, but only to those who knew what normally belonged there. That kind of judgment could not be perfectly taught in a briefing room. Training helped, intelligence helped, route familiarity helped. But convoy crews also developed what soldiers sometimes described as a sixth sense, which was really accumulated experience being processed very quickly. A 2006 Army professional article on convoy security gave a simple example. If a street that was normally full of civilians at a certain hour suddenly had only a few dogs wandering through it, caution was warranted. It might turn out to be nothing, but in a combat environment the absence of normal life could matter as much as the presence of something visibly wrong. The problem was that ordinary Iraq was full of visual noise. Roadsides were not clean, empty margins. They carried debris, loose soil, construction material, damaged guardrails, discarded objects, broken vehicles, drainage ditches, irrigation lines, and market spillover. Convoys moved through places where road conditions themselves were often poor. An Army sustainment article from 2010 discussing main supply route Tampa noted the dangerous condition of road shoulders, the narrowness of many routes, and the fact that logistics convoys often travelled at night on unlit highways. These were not ideal circumstances for separating harmless disorder from deliberate concealment. The soldier or contractor in a vehicle had to look closely but not fixate. There was always another object, another shoulder, another bridge, another lane change coming into view. Culverts became especially important in this world. The 3D Sustainment Brigade, operating in northern Iraq, described IED placement in culverts as an immediate challenge to freedom of movement. The concern was that a deeply buried device under or near the roadway could produce a catastrophic underbelly attack against logistics convoys. In that region alone, more than 1,500 culverts were considered vulnerable to exploitation, which eventually led engineers to deny access to many of them with welded steel grates. This was not a minor engineering detail. It shows how roads were studied feature by feature, how even the practical infrastructure of drainage became part of the convoy threat picture. Other road features drew the same attention. Route clearance and reconnaissance discussions from the period highlighted bridges, canals, guardrails, road signs, and soft dirt along medians or shoulders as places that required particular caution. This does not mean every guardrail or sign was threatening. It means that convoy crews learned to think in terms of opportunity. Where could an explosive be hidden? Where might someone conceal equipment? Where would a device have the greatest chance of affecting a heavy vehicle moving at speed? Those questions were built into route security thinking because the insurgents were also studying the same terrain from the other side. That is what made the roads feel as though they watched back. The phrase is not literal, of course. Roads do not watch anything. But convoys moved with the knowledge that people might be watching them from buildings, vehicles, rooftops, alleys, or fields. The convoy's size made it visible from a long way off. Its route might be known or guessed. Its timing could sometimes become familiar if patterns were not varied. Army convoy security writing emphasized that enemy tactics changed when older methods stopped working, and that leaders needed to review recent enemy techniques and contacts within the previous 72 hours before a mission. The threat was adaptive. Convoy crews were not only looking for hidden devices, they were moving through a contest of observation. A civilian vehicle approaching from behind or moving beside the convoy created a different kind of tension. For much of the war, military convoys tried to maintain standoff from civilian traffic, because a vehicle-borne threat could approach under the cover of normal road movement. Later, during the Share the Road initiative in 2008 and 2009, some of that separation was reduced in order to ease the burden convoys placed on Iraqi traffic. Army sustainment officers noted that this meant civilian vehicles could move in and out of convoy formations more easily, reducing the time gunners had to distinguish between aggressive civilian driving and hostile intent. They also reported encountering civilian trucks that entered convoys simply to travel under the protection of the gun trucks. That small detail captures the confusion of the road. Not every unusual movement was malicious. Sometimes it was opportunistic. Sometimes it was merely reckless. The convoy still had to decide quickly. Imagine what that felt like from inside the vehicle. A car appears in the mirror and begins closing the gap. Is the driver impatient? Lost? Unaware? Trying to pass? Trying to approach? The gunner turns slightly. The vehicle commander watches. The driver ahead adjusts speed. The radio may remain quiet because not every uncertainty becomes a report. But the attention inside the vehicle shifts. If the car falls back, everyone returns to scanning. If it keeps coming, the situation tightens. The hardest part was not that every civilian vehicle was threatening. The hardest part was that almost all of them had to be evaluated quickly, while the convoy continued moving. The road was not empty enough to offer simple answers. At night, this became even more difficult. Many logistics convoys moved after dark, partly because of the operating environment and partly because of efforts to reduce daytime disruption. But the roads were often unlit, which meant drivers and gunners worked inside cones of headlights, instrument glow, and partial moonlight when there was any moonlight at all. An Army sustainment article from 2010 stated plainly that drivers on these night movements were always fearful of being attacked at any moment. Night convoy travel also introduced ordinary traffic dangers, sleepy truck drivers, poor brakes, maintenance failures, and accidents that could create sudden congestion or immobilize vehicles in places where stopping was dangerous. There was a peculiar strain in seeing too much and not enough at once. During the day, the road offered detail everywhere. At night, it withheld detail until the last possible moment. During the day, a roadside mound could be studied, but might drown in 100 other roadside mounds. At night, the same object might suddenly appear in headlights, leaving almost no time for the mind to classify it before the vehicle passed. That is why route familiarity mattered so much. If a crew knew what normally stood at a certain intersection, what kind of civilian traffic usually gathered near a fuel station, or whether a shoulder had looked freshly disturbed on the previous trip, then some of the uncertainty became manageable, not gone, manageable. The roads were also shaped by memory. A place where a convoy had been hit before carried a different atmosphere the next time people approached it. The bend where someone had seen an explosion in the distance. The bridge where another convoy had been struck. The district where small arms fire had come from buildings. The stretch of route associated with repeated roadside bombs. Official accounts from the war preserve many such locations, not because every road was permanently lethal, but because certain road segments became known through repeated danger. A 2009 Army article about a Purple Heart recipient described a convoy approaching a long bridge and seeing smoke ahead from another convoy that had been hit by a roadside bomb and then attacked with small arms fire. That kind of scene reinforced the feeling that the road could turn hostile before a crew ever reached the exact spot of the attack. The knowledge of past attacks also affected how crews reacted to things that seemed wrong. A suspicious object on the side of the road might prompt a halt, a report, or a request for specialised support. In one official Army history, a platoon in 2004 received information about a possible IED near a checkpoint, moved to investigate, and used cannon fire to destroy a suspicious roadside object before resuming movement. Moments later, one of its vehicles was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade as it emerged from beneath an overpass. That sequence is instructive because it shows that danger did not always fit neatly into one category. A convoy could be thinking about roadside explosives and then face a direct fire attack from another direction. The road environment demanded broad alertness, not a single fixed expectation. For logistics convoys especially, the road had to serve two contradictory purposes. It was a lifeline and a hazard at the same time. Trucks needed it to carry food, water, fuel, ammunition, mail, spare parts, and everything else that kept bases functioning. Yet every mile of that lifeline exposed the convoy to risk. The 3rd Sustainment Brigade described its long convoys traversing main and alternate supply routes daily, while also explaining how engineers, route clearance assets, surveillance, and air support had to be synchronized to preserve freedom of movement. That is a useful reminder that moving supplies in Iraq was not merely a transportation problem. It was an operational problem that required its own protective system. Even the road surface itself became part of the mental workload. A crater from a previous blast could force vehicles to shift position. A damaged overpass could change which route was possible. A bottleneck created by checkpoints or road repairs could slow the convoy and compress vehicle spacing. Army logistics writing from 2008 noted that civilian activity, overpasses, and other trafficability issues could directly affect the ability to support units, and that a damaged overpass on a core main supply route impacted logistics far beyond the immediate area of the event. The convoy rider experienced this through jolts, braking, delays, and course changes. But behind those physical sensations was a larger reality. The routes themselves were part of the war's infrastructure, and infrastructure could be attacked. The convoy did not need to be under attack to feel watched. Sometimes the sense came from rooftops, sometimes from windows, sometimes from the sudden quiet of a market area that should have been louder, sometimes from a group of men who seemed too interested in the passing vehicles, sometimes from nothing more than the conviction that the roadside scene had changed since the last mission. Many of these impressions could not be proven. Some were wrong, some were right. The mental cost came from having to take them seriously enough to remain alert without allowing every impression to become panic. There was another complication. The convoy itself changed the road around it. Civilian drivers reacted to it. Pedestrians moved away or paused. Traffic backed up. Shops at intersections temporarily faced walls of passing armour and cargo. Children who had seen convoys hundreds of times still sometimes ran toward the roadside for a better look. Others ignored them entirely. A convoy's presence created ripples, and those ripples could make it harder to tell whether the road was behaving strangely because of danger or because the convoy had arrived. The people inside the vehicles had to make judgments inside a scene they themselves were altering. During the deadliest years of the Iraq War, some support units regarded convoy travel as their most dangerous task. The 2008 Army Logistics article stated this outright, explaining that the mix of IEDs, precision small arms fire, and RPGs made convoys the unit's most dangerous missions in Iraq. That statement matters because it corrects a common misunderstanding. Convoy work was not a safer alternative to combat. In many cases, it was combat exposure structured around repetition and uncertainty. People might roll out day after day, not knowing whether the road would remain uneventful or become the place where the mission was interrupted by violence. And still, the convoy continued. It had to. The road could not simply be surrendered. Every base depended on movement. Every fuel truck that arrived, every pallet that reached a supply point, every vehicle recovered, every unit resupplied was part of keeping the larger force functioning. That meant convoy crews returned to routes that had frightened them, studied roads that had already proved dangerous, and kept learning how the enemy was changing. By June 2003, insurgents had begun attacking convoys with simple IEDs or direct-fire weapons, and the number and sophistication of such attacks increased over time. The convoy road became one of the most persistent contact zones of the war. There is a quiet discipline in that persistence. A crew could not afford to be careless, but it also could not remain in a permanent state of visible alarm. The convoy had to move at a workable pace. Drivers had to keep the formation steady. Gunners had to scan widely rather than lock onto one concern. Leaders had to balance caution with the need to complete the mission. Sometimes they halted, sometimes they pushed on, sometimes they rerouted, sometimes they waited for explosive ordnance disposal teams or route clearance support. The decisions depended on conditions, but the pressure behind them was constant. Delay could increase exposure, speed could reduce observation, stopping could protect against one risk and create another. There was rarely a perfect answer. From a distance, a convoy on an Iraqi highway could look forceful and controlled, a line of armoured vehicles and heavy trucks claiming the road. From inside, the experience was more complicated. The convoy felt strong because it was organised, armed and prepared. It also felt vulnerable because its movement was predictable enough to be studied, because its vehicles were large, because its drivers had routes to follow and schedules to meet, and because the road gave no guarantee that today would resemble yesterday. That was the meaning of roads that watched back. The convoy was never only travelling through the landscape, it was interacting with a landscape that had been shaped by previous attacks, current intelligence, civilian routines, military countermeasures, and the awareness that someone might be observing from outside the field of view. By this point in the mission, the crew had settled into the harsh concentration of the ride. The first minutes outside the wire were over. The gate was far behind them. Ahead, the route continued through places where the same process repeated without pause. Scan, compare, judge, move. Dust struck the armoured windows. The radio came alive, then fell silent again. A bridge approached. A shoulder widened. A vehicle appeared in the distance, drifting slightly within its lane. Nothing had happened yet, but no one inside the convoy mistook that for certainty. The road was still speaking, and the people inside the vehicles were still trying to understand what it meant. By the time the convoy had been on the road for a while, the first sharpness of departure had changed into something steadier and more difficult to describe. The gate was gone. The base was no longer visible. The road ahead had settled into a pattern of pavement, broken shoulders, low buildings, open fields, checkpoints, civilian traffic, and dust kicked up by the vehicles in front. Everyone inside the convoy was still alert, but alertness had become part of the background now, woven into the ride itself. The body had adjusted to the seat as much as it was going to. The armour had stopped feeling newly heavy and simply felt permanent. The engine noise had become a constant presence. The radio crackled, fell silent, came alive again. And around all of it was the environment of the wreck itself, an environment that could make even an uneventful convoy mission physically exhausting. Dust was one of the first things people remembered. It settled on vehicles, clothing, weapons, dashboards, windows, goggles, boots, and gear. At Camp Liberty in Baghdad, army mechanics said dust getting into everything was simply part of daily life, and they warned that dust-clogged air filters could reduce power, reduce acceleration, interfere with shifting, and even leave vehicles needing recovery by wrecker. That fact matters because convoy dust was not only a nuisance. It was part of the maintenance burden, part of the reason vehicles required constant attention before and after missions, and part of the texture of every ride through a dry, heavily travelled route. A vehicle could return from a mission looking as though it had been dipped in beige powder, and the people inside often did not feel much cleaner. If the convoy moved along an unpaved approach road, a gravel section, or a dusty shoulder near a base, the vehicles ahead could throw a cloud behind them thick enough to soften the outlines of the world. The vehicle immediately in front might become a shape rather than a clear object. A gunner could still see movement, still watch sectors, still perform the task, but the job became harder. In the driver's seat, attention narrowed to the road surface, brake lights, the edge of the vehicle ahead, and whatever could still be seen beyond the haze. Dust did not always blind a convoy, but it made the world less precise, and convoy travel depended on precision. The Army's own accounts of Iraq-era transportation work repeatedly describe sandy terrain, potholed roads, and the practical difficulty of keeping vehicles mission-ready in that environment. There was also the dust that did not arrive dramatically. It simply accumulated. A fine layer gathered along the seams of the door, across the console, around radio controls, on the edge of a glove, or in the folds of a uniform sleeve. Someone might drag a finger across a dusty surface without thinking, leaving one dark line behind. After a while, the dust became almost ordinary, until a person returned to a relatively clean room and realised just how much of Iraq had come back with them. One soldier, later recalling a 2004 deployment, described a face covered in sweat and dust, sand on everything, and roads scarred by blast damage and improvised repairs. That memory could have belonged to many who spent their days moving by vehicle through the war. Heat was worse because there was no ignoring it. During the Iraq War, the inside of an armoured vehicle could become an extremely difficult place to work. An Army logistics bulletin reported that after Humvees were fitted with add-on armour, interior temperatures could rise as high as 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Air conditioning systems were added, but even then interior temperatures could still reach 95 degrees, which the Army described as untenable enough to drive the development of liquid-cooled vests for some crews in Iraq and Kuwait. Those vests circulated chilled water from the vehicle's air conditioning system beneath body armour. That is a remarkable detail, not because every soldier rode with such equipment, but because it shows the seriousness of the problem. Heat inside armoured vehicles was not a mild discomfort. It affected endurance and the ability to stay sharp over hours of movement. The convoy rider had very few ways to escape that heat. Body armour trapped warmth against the torso. Helmets held heat around the head. Gloves, long sleeves, protective eyewear, and the limited air movement inside the vehicle added to the feeling that the body was always working even while seated. A person might drink water steadily and still feel dry. Sweat gathered under straps and along the edges of armour plates. The back of the seat warmed against the uniform. The metal and glass around the crew turned the cabin into a sealed work compartment, necessary for protection and punishing for comfort. In 2010, Army convoy security soldiers still described long, exhausting drives and the need to inspect and repair MRAPs immediately afterward before rest could begin. The mission did not end when the engine shut off. Air conditioning therefore became more than a convenience. In one Army account from Iraq, mechanics stressed the importance of cooling systems in up-armoured vehicles, and logistics publications discussed the need to keep vehicle air conditioning functioning because the equipment and the crews depended on it. dust could damage or clog systems. Doors opening and closing during staging or halts let heat in. A cooling system that struggled during a long ride was not an abstract maintenance concern. It altered the entire mood of the vehicle. People became quieter. Movements grew more deliberate. Every pause in airflow was noticed. The convoy still had to operate at the same level of attention, even as the physical burden climbed. Heat also distorted time. 10 minutes in an overheated vehicle could feel longer than 20 minutes in a cooler one. A route that looked manageable on a map became something else once the crew had spent hours sealed in armour, listening to radio traffic, scanning road shoulders, and feeling the climate pressing inward through every surface. This is where many popular images of modern war miss something important. They show vehicles as symbols of power, but they rarely show how tiring it was simply to sit inside one while remaining ready. The convoy's strength did not spare its occupants from discomfort. In many ways, that strength increased it. More armour often meant more heat, more weight, and less space. The soundscape of the ride had its own discipline. Engines dominated first. Heavy vehicles did not glide. They rumbled, shook, and vibrated. Tyres struck broken pavement. Loose equipment clicked or rattled. Metal complained softly over long miles. In some vehicles, the cooling system added a steady mechanical breath. Above all of it came the radio. It was not constantly alive, but it was never mentally absent. A soldier in a convoy vehicle listened differently from someone listening to ordinary background noise. Every transmission might matter. Every pause before a response might matter. Every call sign had a place in the convoy's moving structure. Army reporting from 2010 described convoy escort teams relying on Harris radio systems, with soldiers responsible for troubleshooting problems and keeping communication open and clear because vehicle function, radio function, and the ability to get out of danger quickly were all tied together. A convoy's radio traffic could be plain and technical. Vehicle checks. Confirmation that the line remained intact. Notice of a turn. A call about civilian traffic entering or leaving the convoy space. A warning that the route narrowed ahead. A report that one truck was slowing. In smaller patrols, commanders could maintain situational awareness visually and through radios while civilian traffic moved around them. In larger logistics convoys, some stretching more than 5 kilometres, command and control became far more difficult because gun trucks might not even have a direct view of one another. That meant the radio was not an accessory to the convoy. It was one of the only ways the convoy remained a convoy rather than a string of separate vehicles sharing the same road. Inside each vehicle, the radio shaped attention. When it was busy, people listened for what directly concerned them and filtered out the rest as best they could. When it was quiet, the silence created its own pressure. Quiet could mean everything was proceeding normally. Most of the time, that was exactly what it meant. But in a convoy environment, silence also left more room for road noise, more room for private thought, and more room for the mind to wonder whether the next voice on the net would arrive calmly or sharply. A convoy could spend long stretches with no dramatic radio call at all, and those stretches were not empty. They were filled with scanning, heat, dust, and the constant, unfinished possibility of interruption. Army accounts of convoy work during Operation New Dawn emphasised that waiting itself, including waiting for threats to decrease, sandstorms to clear, or roadside bomb clearance to finish, became one of the challenges of the mission. Night movements changed the relationship between radio chatter and silence. One Army article on the 299th Brigade Support Battalion in Baghdad described soldiers moving through Iraqi streets in the silence of night to support forward operating bases, noting that some missions were conducted at night because traffic was lighter, coalition forces were less visible, and the chance of accidents was lower. That did not make night convoy travel restful. It simply exchanged one kind of burden for another. The darkness reduced some visual clutter, but it also reduced certainty. The radio might become more important because each vehicle saw less. A warning from the front of the convoy travelled by voice long before those farther back could understand why the pace had changed. A person who has never ridden in a military convoy might imagine constant conversation inside the vehicle, especially on a long mission. Sometimes there was talk. People still complained, joked, shared small comments, or asked practical questions. But the tone was not like a normal drive with friends. Conversation came and went around the demands of the mission. A driver could not sink into a story if the roadway required both hands and complete focus. A vehicle commander could answer briefly, then return to scanning. A gunner in the turret occupied a separate world where casual talk was harder and sometimes impossible. Radio chatter replaced many ordinary interactions because the convoy had to speak to itself first. The people inside each vehicle then fit their own words into whatever space remained. This is partly inference from the structure of convoy work, supported by Army descriptions of communications, crew coordination, and the need for constant vigilance. There was also the particular sound of nothing happening. No shouted warning, no explosion, no sudden command. Only wheels, engine, air system, occasional radio, and the road moving beneath the vehicle. In civilian life, a quiet ride is usually pleasant. In convoy life, quiet could be relieving without being relaxing. The crew wanted the mission to remain uneventful. Everyone preferred silence to contact. Yet maintaining vigilance through silence was difficult. Army escort troops in 2010 described complacency as one of the dangers of convoy missions, precisely because long distances, inconsistent schedules, and extended waiting could make alertness harder to sustain. Some missions lasted days, and soldiers could be on duty for up to 24 hours depending on requirements and problems that arose. Silence became another environment they had to work through. Dust, heat, and radio traffic also interacted with fatigue in ways that were not always obvious in the moment. Dust strained the eyes and complicated maintenance. Heat taxed the body. Radios demanded continued mental sorting. The route demanded visual scanning. The driver controlled a heavy armoured vehicle over sandy terrain and damaged roads. The commander watched for threats and communicated with others. The gunner looked outward for anything that did not fit. An army article about convoy escort teams described these three soldiers as acting together as one sensor, which is a strikingly practical phrase. It captures the reality that the vehicle's safety depended not on one heroic observer, but on several tired people each covering a different part of the problem. On some stretches, the convoy passed open ground where dust trailed behind vehicles in long low plumes. On others, it entered urban streets where heat bounced off buildings, and the road felt hemmed in by walls, shops, parked cars, and narrow turns. The radio sounded different in these spaces, not technically, but emotionally. A transmission received on a broad highway could feel routine. The same transmission while moving slowly through a dense street felt more immediate. Night convoys in Baghdad moved supplies quietly because the mission required it, but even quiet streets had to be read closely. Less traffic did not mean no risk. It meant a different pattern of risk and movement. The smell inside a convoy vehicle is harder to document formally, but it is not hard to reconstruct from the conditions that army sources describe. Diesel fumes around staging areas, dust, hot fabric, sweat held under armour, plastic warmed by the sun, metal surfaces that had spent hours heating in the Iraqi climate, bottled water. Perhaps the faint trace of food opened quickly before departure. Such details are not usually the concern of official histories, but they are part of why convoy veterans often remembered the experience so physically. The war was not only what they saw, it was what stayed on the skin, what coated the tongue, what settled in the throat, what made a person long for a clean shower before the mission had even ended. The prevalence of dust and extreme vehicle heat in army reporting supports that reconstruction. When a convoy halted even briefly, the sensory world changed again. Engines might remain running. Dust clouds could catch up and roll past. The heat inside a stopped vehicle often felt worse because the slight relief of motion disappeared. Radios became more active if the stop had a reason that required coordination. Or the halt could be maddeningly quiet if everyone was waiting for information. Escort soldiers in Iraq reported waiting for roadside bomb clearance, sandstorms to clear, threat levels to change, vehicles to be repaired, and, in the most unsettling phrasing, waiting for an attack. That is one of the most revealing descriptions of convoy life. Waiting was not rest. Waiting was the mission stretched thin. A sandstorm or heavy dust could delay movement altogether. It might reduce visibility enough that pushing forward became unwise, or it might complicate air support, route clearance, or the coordination of multiple elements. Official Army reporting about convoy escort work during the drawdown years specifically notes that soldiers sometimes had to wait for sandstorms to clear. To someone outside the military, that may sound like a weather inconvenience. To a convoy crew, it affected timing, security, rest, fuel planning, and the total length of exposure. The mission schedule belonged partly to command, partly to traffic, partly to threat conditions, and partly to the environment itself. Even without a storm, ordinary blowing dust made Iraq feel close. It blurred the division between outside and inside. The convoy was sealed by armour, but not separated from the country it crossed. Dust got into machines. Heat got into bodies. The road affected mood, concentration, and conversation. A convoy's protective shell could block fragments and reduce vulnerability, but it could not make the trip comfortable. It could not stop fatigue from accumulating. It could not guarantee that the radio would stay routine. It could not turn the road into something passive. This is why an uneventful convoy ride could still feel heavy by the time it was over. No blast, no ambush, no emergency stop, and yet everyone climbed out knowing they had worked. The driver had worked. The gunner had worked. The commander had worked. Passengers who spent the route watching, listening and waiting had worked in their own way. The vehicle returned dusty. The crew returned tired. The radios fell quiet only after they were no longer needed. Maintenance checks began. Fluids were inspected. Filters, systems and damage were considered. Rest waited behind responsibility. The convoy's silence ended not with relief exactly, but with a slow release of attention that had been held too tightly for too long. Army accounts of escort teams in Iraq emphasise that even after exhausting drives, soldiers often addressed vehicle repair and mission readiness before sleep. And still, the strongest memory of the ride was not always the heat or the noise. Sometimes it was what all those things concealed. Dust could hide the road shoulder. Engine vibration could blur a subtle change in movement. Radio traffic could fill a second when a person wished they had been looking harder out the window. The long burden of the ride mattered because it surrounded the convoy with distractions while demanding total attention. That was the cruel balance of the road. The mind had to stay awake inside discomfort. The eyes had to keep moving through dust. The ears had to listen through noise. And beneath all of it, just beyond the next bridge, the next culvert, the next patch of recently disturbed earth, waited the fear that defined so much of convoy travel in Iraq. The fear of what might already be buried before the convoy ever arrived. That was the fear that lived beneath so many convoy rides in Iraq. Not only the fear of being seen, or followed, or fired upon from a window. The more specific fear was lower than that. It was under the wheels, beside the shoulder, inside a culvert, buried in soft ground, hidden beneath trash, waiting in a place a person might look directly at and still not understand in time. Improvised explosive devices became one of the central dangers of the Iraq War, and by July 2008 the Government Accountability Office reported that roughly 75% of casualties in ongoing combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan were attributed to IEDs. That single figure explains much of what changed about convoy life during those years. It explains the heavier armour. It explains the rise of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. It explains route clearance patrols, new protective systems, intelligence cells, changed convoy procedures, and the way ordinary roadside dirt began to command the attention of men and women moving through the country in armoured vehicles. The word improvise can sound small, almost makeshift, as if it described something crude and unserious. In Iraq it did not. The term covered a wide family of devices that changed across the war, and the threat kept evolving in response to American protection measures. When US forces added armour to Humvees, insurgents increased the size and explosive force of IEDs and made use of explosively formed penetrators, weapons designed to defeat armoured vehicles. The baseline MRAP program was built around the need to improve protection against mines, IEDs, small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenades, but even that program had to adapt as the threat changed. This was not a fixed contest between one bomb and one vehicle. It was an ongoing struggle between attack and protection, concealment and detection, roadside improvisation, and industrial-scale countermeasures. For a convoy crew, the fear of what was buried began long before any explosion. It entered the mission during the brief. It sat beside the route map. It appeared in references to culverts, previous finds, recently disturbed ground, trash piles, choke points, and areas where attacks had occurred before. It remained present when the convoy left the wire and became sharper as the road opened into stretches where visibility was imperfect and the shoulders offered too many places to hide something. The 3D Sustainment Brigade, which moved long logistics convoys across northern Iraq in 2007 and 2008, described EEDs emplaced in culverts as an immediate challenge to freedom of movement. The brigade noted that a deeply buried device could produce an underbelly attack with catastrophic consequences, and that more than 1,500 culverts in its area were vulnerable enough to demand attention. Those are the kinds of numbers that make a convoy rider look differently at every drainage opening beside a road. A person outside that world might imagine danger as something obvious. A suspicious box, a wire plainly visible, a mound of earth so fresh that anyone would notice it. But convoy crews were dealing with a landscape where harmless mess and possible threat often resembled each other. Roadsides in Iraq could be crowded with broken concrete, scraps of metal, abandoned tyres, burnt debris, ordinary trash, irrigation cuts, and damage left by previous blasts or poor maintenance. Army route clearance stories from later years describe the difficulty of examining piles of debris because attackers in Iraq and Afghanistan had hidden IEDs in trash, Ds in... The important thing is not to picture every pile as a weapon. Most were not. The important thing is to understand the mental burden created when the dangerous object did not always look dangerous. That burden changed the way the ground was seen. A driver had to keep the vehicle steady, maintain spacing, and watch the road immediately ahead. A gunner had to scan outward, not downward alone, because danger could also come from rooftops, vehicles, and alleyways. A vehicle commander might be trying to do both in fragments, watching the route, listening to the radio, and comparing the terrain to what had been briefed. No one could stare at every patch of dirt. No one could study every pothole long enough to feel certain. Yet uncertainty did not remove responsibility. The convoy still had to pass. This is one reason route clearance teams became so important. In official army descriptions, their mission was to patrol roads and clear them of IEDs before convoys used them, reducing unnecessary injury and helping other units move. Convoy crews knew those teams mattered because, in the most direct sense, route clearance was meant to find the danger before the convoy did. There is a particular cruelty in buried danger because it creates fear without offering a visible opponent. A person can understand being shot at least in the immediate human sense. There is a direction to turn toward, a place to return fire, a shape to search for. A buried device offers no such certainty. It may be triggered at the exact moment the vehicle passes. It may detonate after the lead vehicle beneath the second or third. It may never explode at all because the attack fails or the convoy's line misses the intended point. For those inside the vehicles, the absence of an explosion did not prove the absence of danger. It only meant the road had allowed them through this time. The Army's own acquisition history shows how seriously the service interpreted that threat, creating rapid fielding and rapid equipping mechanisms that worked with organisations devoted to defeating IEDs and moving protective technologies quickly to deployed troops. By the middle years of the war, fear of buried explosives shaped not only the riders' thoughts, but the entire design of the vehicle around them. The MRAP program moved rapidly because casualties from IEDs had become so severe. In May 2007, the Secretary of Defense designated MRAP as the Department of Defense's single most important acquisition program, and by mid-2008 more than 6,600 vehicles had been fielded. That urgency reflected the belief that the shape of the vehicle itself mattered. A higher V-shaped hull could deflect part of a blast away from the crew compartment more effectively than earlier designs. This did not make crews invulnerable, and official reports were clear that evolving threats such as explosively formed penetrators continued to challenge even heavily armoured vehicles. But the fielding of MRAPs marked one of the clearest signs that the road had forced military adaptation on a vast scale. The explosively formed penetrator deserves mention because it occupied a special place in the convoy imagination. It was not simply another roadside bomb. US officials in 2007 described EFP components and technology as a serious force protection issue in Iraq, and GAO reporting noted that these weapons were capable of penetrating heavily armoured vehicles. The specific technical mechanics are less important here than the effect they had on convoy psychology. If a device could threaten vehicles that had already been made heavier and stronger in response to earlier attacks, then armour could no longer be mistaken for certainty. It was protection, valuable protection, but not a guarantee. That distinction mattered every time a convoy rolled past a wall, a median, a parked vehicle, or any place from which an attack might be concealed. Some accounts from the war make that fear painfully concrete. Staff Sergeant Eric Cowan was in Baghdad on June 9, 2009, when his vehicle was struck by an explosively formed penetrator only about 50 metres before his convoy's mission would have been complete. The Army later reported that his left foot was amputated after the attack. The detail about the distance remaining is difficult to forget. 50 metres. The convoy was nearly done. People outside the military often imagine danger as something concentrated at the beginning of a mission or in a notorious danger area. But for convoy crews, the road did not stop being dangerous because the destination was close. The last stretch could still hold everything the first stretch held. Another Army account tells of Staff Sergeant John Burrell, whose 4-vehicle convoy was struck less than half a mile from a forward operating base while moving towards Sadr City. He described the route near an overpass as cluttered with trash and debris, making it extremely difficult to watch everything. The convoy was moving slowly, no more than 5 miles per hour when the attack came. Burrell said he did not hear an explosion at first. Everything simply went black. The vehicle had been hit by multiple EFP charges, badly damaged and caught fire. His recollection captures something official statistics cannot. The fear of what was buried or concealed was not abstract. It arose from experiences in which crews could be alert, could be moving carefully, could know the area was dangerous and still be overwhelmed in a second. It would be easy to take stories like these and imagine convoy crews moving in a permanent state of terror. That would not be accurate. People cannot function for months that way. They adapted. They built routine around danger. They still joked, complained, ate snacks in the vehicle, argued about schedules, and did all the ordinary human things that war never fully removes. But adaptation did not mean indifference. It meant learning how to carry the threat without letting it stop the mission. The fear of buried explosives became part of posture. It sat in the way someone leaned forward approaching a culvert, the way a gunner held attention near an overpass, the way a driver favoured certain portions of the lane when conditions allowed, the way a truck commander watched a suspicious patch of ground until it passed out of view. Official convoy and route security writings from Iraq show how deeply threat awareness was built into movement planning, from route clearance coordination to protection measures against roadside explosive hazards. There was also the waiting created by suspicion. A convoy might stop because something appeared out of place, because an earlier element reported a possible device, or because route clearance teams were investigating. From inside a halted vehicle, time changed again. The engine might keep running. The radio became more active. Dust settled around the tyres. The people inside looked outward through glass and tried to understand why the convoy was no longer moving. Waiting for confirmation could feel almost as tense as motion, because the convoy now occupied one place rather than passing through it. Army convoy security personnel later described waiting for roadside bombs to be cleared as a recurring part of the job, alongside waiting for weather, repairs, and changes in the threat picture. A road that seemed empty when seen through a windshield became a place to sit and wonder what the ground nearby held. Need correct citation. I accidentally referenced non-existent turn 46408 search. Need fix. We have turn from previous chapter, maybe turn not in current web session. The citation references must come from this session. Yes, web sources in this conversation are accessible, but turn 46408. Not in this analysis. Actually, earlier assistant used some raw URLs, not web citations, but those are not present as refs. Need not use. Need replace with current sources. Maybe turn 694716. Search 13 says unit in front found IED and EOD took care of it. Search for Army article on wait. Need maybe not necessary. We can rephrase to avoid specific recurring job or site route clearance purpose. Could use turn 694716 search 13 for waiting after route clearance found IED. Let's revise paragraph accordingly. Need continue writing. Need perhaps discuss route clearance and modernization. Could mention RCVs. Modernization program in Kuwait 2008. This fits. Need perhaps discuss search for attackers versus device, but keep scope. Maybe mention counter IED assets, route clearance vehicles, turn 277914 view 1. Could also mention Army's culvert mitigation grates maybe from turn 333598 view 1 and likely next page. Search maybe find grates. Use find in view 1. Need if we mention. Could perhaps open lines after 1280. Let's find. Bypassing maybe no need, but nice detail about denial grates on culverts. Search within PDF for grates or culverts. Need web.find. Do it. Need maybe after output, maybe use content. Let's search. Also perhaps fetch turn 865666 view 1 later lines around culverts. Use find. Need not if not necessary. The convoy had been built to move. Every briefing, every inspection, every radio check, every tightened strap and tested weapon existed for that reason. Movement gave the convoy shape. It gave the drivers a task, the gunners a rhythm, the commanders a sequence of decisions. As long as the vehicles kept rolling, the road ahead could be read in passing. A suspicious shoulder appeared, was judged, and slipped behind them. A bridge approached, tightened every gaze, and then gave way to open road again. A sedan on the side of the highway caught attention, then fell away in the mirror. Motion did not make the convoy safe, but it prevented the road from gathering too tightly around it. And that is why the moment the convoy stopped could feel so heavy. Not every stop meant danger. Many did not. But once the tyres quit turning outside the wire, everyone inside understood that the mission had changed. The convoy was no longer passing through uncertainty. It was sitting inside it. A stop could begin with something ordinary. A vehicle ahead slowed too much. Civilian traffic compressed at an intersection. A checkpoint backed up. A turn came sharper than expected. A truck in the convoy reported a problem. The radio changed tone. Drivers eased off accelerators. Brake lights appeared in sequence. The line that had been stretching forward through Iraq shortened and hardened into place. From outside, it may have looked like nothing more than traffic. From inside, it felt different. The driver's body leaned slightly with the deceleration. The gunner's scanning became slower and more deliberate because the world outside no longer moved past. The person in the passenger seat lifted attention from the next mile to the immediate surroundings. Walls, rooftops, cars, culverts, windows, people standing nearby. All of them became more important because the convoy was now giving the landscape time to answer back. This heightened exposure during a stop was not merely a feeling. Army mechanics in Iraq described an off-base breakdown as something that stopped an entire convoy and created an opportunity for enemy attack. Mechanical failure was one of the least dramatic reasons for a stop, and one of the most aggravating. A truck did not need to be destroyed to become a problem. A belt could fail. A minor component could give out. A tyre could go bad. An engine could lose power. A transmission problem could emerge only after hours on the road. Army mechanics supporting convoy operations in Iraq stressed that a cheap, small part could ground a vehicle on the side of the road, which is exactly why preventive maintenance before missions mattered so much. Recovery teams and wreckers rode with convoys because once a vehicle broke down outside the wire, the question was not only how to fix it, the question was how quickly the convoy could regain movement before stillness became risk. Picture the stop caused by a breakdown. The convoy commander receives the report. The vehicle is losing power or cannot continue safely. The convoy halts or adjusts around it, depending on the location and the plan. A recovery vehicle begins moving into position. Mechanics prepare to dismount if the situation allows. Security vehicles shift attention outward. Someone watches the road ahead. Someone else watches behind. A gunner who had been scanning a moving horizon now fixes on a building line or roadside ditch and does not look away quickly. Civilian traffic may continue at a distance, or it may begin to bunch, adding confusion. Inside the broken vehicle, the crew has its own frustration. They did everything they were supposed to do before departure. They checked the truck. They trusted it. Now the whole convoy is exposed because something mechanical has gone wrong. The Army's 2010 account of convoy mechanics makes clear why those recovery teams mattered. When immediate repair was not possible, the wrecker towed the disabled vehicle onward rather than leaving it stranded. There is a reason some transporters remembered the earliest years of the Iraq War as a time when convoys avoided stopping almost at all costs. A 2010 Army article comparing conditions in 2003 with those in later years quoted one motor transport operator who said his lieutenant had ordered the convoy not to stop for anything. The same article explained that early convoys relied on speed to stay safer, before later improvements in armour, electronic warfare systems, and rules governing road use changed the operating environment. That memory is valuable because it shows how stopping was understood in those early years. It was not merely inconvenient, it was something crews had been trained to distrust. Yet by the later years of the war, convoys sometimes had to stop more often and for more complicated reasons. Security conditions in parts of Iraq had changed. Road-sharing policies shifted under the status of forces framework. Convoys in towns or cities could require Iraqi police or army escort. Vehicle speeds changed. Civilian traffic interacted more closely with military movement than during the harsher road control practices of the mid-war years. None of that made a stop feel comfortable. It simply meant that convoy crews had to operate in a more layered environment, one where remaining mobile was still desirable, but not always possible. The same 2010 Army article noted that by then, some convoys in southern Iraq travelled at slower speeds and in a different tactical context from the early days of 2003. The most tense stop was the one caused by suspicion. Something on the roadside did not look right. A bag appeared to be weighted down. Wires were visible. A car sat in a place that made no sense. A report came over the radio that another element had found a possible explosive device ahead. The convoy slowed, then stopped short of the danger. The people inside the vehicles might not be able to see the object that halted them. They only knew movement had ceased because someone, somewhere near the front, had judged that continuing forward was worse than sitting still. In convoy training at Camp Adder in 2009, soldiers practiced exactly this kind of event. They spotted a suspicious roadside object, stopped the convoy, and called up a report for possible unexploded ordnance. The same exercise then forced them to handle a simulated explosion, a disabled MRAP, casualty rescue, perimeter security and vehicle recovery before moving again. The training was theatrical only in the sense that it happened on a lane rather than on an Iraqi road. The sequence reflected the real problems convoys had to solve. A historical example from the 106th Transportation Battalion shows how complicated a stop for a suspected explosive could become. As one convoy approached an overpass in Iraq, military police reported that an IED had been found on the overpass and that an explosive ordnance disposal team was inbound. The convoy halted short of the overpass and waited in a linear formation. Gun trucks took up security positions. Civilian traffic was directed away. This was already a vulnerable moment. A long convoy sitting in the open, focused on a known explosive threat ahead. Then, as the EOD vehicle arrived on the overpass, insurgents fired rocket-propelled grenades toward the bridge, followed by small arms fire from nearby buildings. The official Transportation Corps account notes that the convoy was not the apparent primary target of the first shots. The arriving EOD personnel seemed to have been, but the convoy was sitting there all the same, exposed in the same kill space, and the gun trucks responded immediately. That episode captures why a halted convoy could feel so dangerous. A stop drew attention. It created a pattern. It gathered vehicles into a place rather than allowing them to pass through. It gave attackers more time to act, or at least crews feared that it might. The stopped convoy near the overpass had done what procedure required. It had halted because an IED had been identified. It had positioned security. It had waited for specialists. The danger came not from incompetence, but from the fact that every sensible response carried its own risk. Continue forward, and the convoy could hit the device. Stop, and the convoy could be observed, targeted, or drawn into a layered attack. That was the logic of the road in Iraq. The safest available choice was not always safe. The pause before EOD arrived could feel endless, even when it was not. The people inside vehicles might hear only fragments over the radio. The object is ahead. The route is closed. EOD inbound. Hold position. Security out. Watch left. Watch right. Nothing dramatic in the wording, yet each message deepened the awareness that the convoy was now bound to one piece of road. A person's imagination could do unnecessary work in that kind of silence. Was the suspicious object real? Was someone watching from the buildings? Would the delay stretch into minutes, or much longer? Would another convoy appear behind them and complicate the traffic? The Army's account of that 2004 convoy halt gives us the procedure. What it cannot fully record is how the stop must have felt to the drivers, gunners, and passengers waiting in line beneath the overpass threat. That part is an inference, but one strongly supported by the nature of the situation and by the actions taken to secure the convoy while it waited. Stops caused by actual attacks were different again. Sometimes a blast occurred and the convoy kept moving until it was clear of the immediate danger. In 2011, an Army account described an MRAP crew on a convoy security mission that noticed a suspicious sedan near a checkpoint. The vehicle-borne explosive detonated as the MRAP manoeuvred past it, filling the vehicle with shock, flames and debris. The blast threw the vehicle's hood across the front windows, blocking the driver's view. The truck commander ordered him to keep moving, and the driver guided the MRAP by feel until they were far enough from the blast area to stop and help the injured gunner. That detail matters. The immediate goal after a detonation was not always to halt exactly where the attack occurred. Sometimes the vehicle's survival depended on creating distance first. Only then did the stop become possible. In other situations, a convoy stopped because people inside it had been hurt and there was no way around that fact. In 2007, a quick reaction force left Forward Operating Base Normandy to assist a patrol that had already been struck by an IED. Before it could complete that mission, The first vehicle in the convoy was hit by another AED. The remaining vehicles moved to surround the scene. Medics reached the wounded. Soldiers worked to extract an injured gunner whose leg was trapped inside the Humvee. He was moved to a litter, stabilised, and sent onward for evacuation. In that kind of stop, the convoy's purpose narrowed instantly. The destination, the schedule, the larger movement plan all fell behind the immediate need to protect the site and save the person in front of them. A stopped convoy after a blast had a completely different sound from a stopped convoy waiting on a mechanic or EOD team. Radios became urgent. People shouted over engine noise. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. Commands moved in short bursts. Medics worked. Security elements watched outward because the first attack might not be the last. Vehicle crews tried to determine who was injured, what vehicle could still move, what equipment had been damaged, and whether the area itself remained dangerous. Training in Iraq deliberately rehearsed this sequence. Explosion, security around the convoy, casualty extraction, stretcher movement, towing the damaged vehicle, and resumption of movement once the situation permitted. The fact that these steps appeared in formal battle drills tells you how central they were to convoy life. There were also stops that began with a choice, not an attack or breakdown. A leader might halt to inspect a suspicious vehicle. That too could be deadly. In November 2006, First Lieutenant Michael Cerrone was riding in the lead Humvee of a convoy near Samara when the convoy stopped and he got out to examine a suspicious vehicle while his gunner covered him. An explosive device detonated, killing both men. The Army article recounting the incident notes that reports differed on whether the device was in the vehicle or carried by a man who approached from it. What remains clear is the central danger of the stop. Once people dismounted to examine a threat, they entered the uncertainty directly. This was one of the cruelest aspects of the Iraq convoy environment. A stop could be necessary precisely because someone had seen something suspicious. But stopping reduced distance, increased exposure, and could force people to dismount into a situation designed to exploit that reaction. The crews knew this. Training emphasized judgment, communication, and the need for designated procedures rather than improvised heroics. Yet decisions on the road still had to be made in real time. Continue or halt, bypass or investigate, call for support or keep moving. These were not abstract tactical puzzles. They were decisions about whether several people would remain enclosed in armoured vehicles or step into open air beside a road that had already raised suspicion. Sometimes, a convoy stopped because another convoy or patrol ahead had already created a blockage. The April 2004 Transportation Corps history shows routes being closed by IEDs, convoys attacked on major supply roads, and traffic patterns changing quickly during the uprising around Baghdad. When road systems became disrupted by attacks, one convoy's problem became another convoy's delay. A unit might be warned away, rerouted, or forced to wait while the danger ahead was addressed. The road network in Iraq was not a set of isolated episodes. It was a living system, and one halt could ripple outward. The halted convoy also changed the role of time. While moving, the crew thought in miles and landmarks. During a stop, they thought in minutes, and what those minutes might be costing. How long has the route been closed? How long has the broken truck been sitting there? How long since the blast? How long until the wrecker hooks up? How long before EOD arrives? A short wait could feel too long if the place seemed exposed. A long wait could begin to feel almost unreal. The convoy suspended between mission phases, no longer travelling and not yet able to resolve the stop. Soldiers trained for convoy lanes in Iraq precisely because movement could be interrupted by suspected explosives, casualties, and disabled vehicles, and because the convoy had to recover its rhythm under pressure. When security vehicles repositioned during a halt, the change was visible from inside the line. A gun truck might pull out to cover a flank, another might shift rearward. Personnel might dismount to control local traffic or establish security, depending on the situation. In the overpass incident involving the 1487th Convoy, the gun trucks moved to right security, screening positions and rear security, while the convoy waited on EOD. This had to happen quickly because the convoy's defensive shape when stationary was not the same as its defensive shape while moving. While driving, spacing and sequence provided part of its protection. While stopped, security had to become more outward-facing and deliberate. A stop during which nothing happened could leave people strangely drained. The convoy resumed movement. The radios calmed. The line stretched out again. The suspicious object was cleared or judged safe. The truck was repaired or towed. The checkpoint passed. The temporary congestion dissolved. From the outside, the mission continued as though the pause had been minor. Inside, bodies often needed a few minutes to release the tension of stillness. A gunner might flex fingers around the weapon grip. A driver might settle shoulders back against the seat. Someone in the vehicle might realise they had been holding their breath more often than necessary. The road returned to motion, but the stop remained behind them in memory because it had forced the convoy to become a target-shaped thing, even if no attack came. This is an inference from the well-documented vulnerability of stopped convoys and the repeated emphasis in army accounts on minimising exposure and regaining movement when possible. One reason the stop mattered so much is that convoy missions were built around logistics, and logistics depends on time, food, fuel, water, ammunition, repair parts, equipment, and people were moving because other units needed them. The 2010 Army report on transporters in Iraq emphasised how distribution platoons delivered supplies over repeated combat logistics convoys to joint security stations and bases. A halted convoy was not only exposed, it was delayed. In war, delay can spread quietly. A stalled fuel truck affects generators, vehicles, and planned movements. Delayed repair parts affect maintenance. Delayed water affects a base's day in a way no one outside the logistics chain sees clearly. This did not mean crews recklessly rushed through danger. It means every stop carried both tactical and practical weight, and still crews stopped when they had to. That is the part worth noticing. The stories of convoy life are not only about pushing through, they are also about knowing when movement had become the greater risk, when the road ahead needed specialists, when a person needed medical care, when a disabled vehicle could not be abandoned, when an object on the roadside justified halting a line of trucks under an open sky. Courage in that environment did not always look like accelerating. Sometimes it looked like holding position because the job required it, even while every instinct in the vehicle wanted the wheels turning again. By the time the convoy started moving once more, the road felt different. It had already interrupted them. It had proven it could seize control of the mission with a mechanical failure, a suspicious object, a traffic blockage, or violence. The vehicles returned to pace. The gunners resumed their wider scanning. The drivers rebuilt spacing. Radio traffic thinned back toward routine. But the stop stayed in the body a little longer. Every next slowdown felt more meaningful than it had before. Every next brake light seemed to ask a question. And as the convoy continued deeper into the route, every person knew that movement could break again without warning, forcing them back into that exposed, difficult stillness where the road seemed to gather around them and wait. The first glimpse of the gate on the return route did not erase the road behind them. It did not make the last miles harmless. It did not mean the convoy had already arrived. In some ways, those final stretches could feel almost unfair. The vehicles had gone out, completed the mission, survived the road, endured the heat, the dust, the radio traffic, the waiting, the suspicion, and now the walls of the base were somewhere ahead. A tower might become visible first, then a line of barriers. Then the entrance control point where soldiers stood watch and vehicles entered in sequence. It was close enough to imagine water, shade, food, a shower, maybe sleep. But the convoy was still outside the wire until the last vehicle crossed back through it, and history offered hard reminders that the return leg could be just as dangerous as the outbound movement. In one 2005 incident later recalled by an Army Reserve Sergeant Major, a gun truck struck an IED as the convoy was returning to base, killing the soldier who had been sitting in the seat he himself had occupied earlier that day. The road did not become safe simply because the mission was nearly over. That is the thing I want you to hold on to as we come back with them. The sight of the gate mattered, but it did not permit a full exhale. Not yet. The convoy still had to maintain spacing. Drivers still had to watch the road. Gunners still had to scan the shoulders, the rooftops, the traffic, and the last bends before the entrance. Truck commanders still listened to the net. The convoy commander still needed accountability, vehicle order, and a clean arrival. For those inside, the mind may already have started leaning toward relief, but the body remained in mission posture. It is reasonable to infer that the final approach created a particular tension of its own, close enough to safety that everyone felt it, but not close enough to relax without risk. The documented threat to convoys on return routes supports that understanding, as does the Army's continued emphasis on vigilance, spacing and convoy safety throughout Iraq operations and the later drawdown period. The gate itself was more than an opening in a perimeter. It was one of the central filters of base life. Entry control points were manned deliberately, and on larger installations they formed part of a constant protective routine that most people on the base rarely considered, unless they were passing through them. In January 2010, for example, Army National Guard soldiers operating the main entry control point at Q West in Iraq marked 6 months of duty without a security breach, a quiet statistic that says a great deal about the importance placed on controlling who and what came inside. Elsewhere, escort soldiers described bringing Iraqi transportation vehicles back to an entry control point after completing movements inside a base logistics system. The gate was not ceremonial, it was a working security boundary, and returning convoys had to pass through it as deliberately as they had left. So the convoy approached slowly, or at least more slowly than it had travelled on open road. The entrance narrowed movement by design. Barriers shaped the lanes. Guards watched the incoming vehicles. The lead truck made the turn, entered the controlled approach and began the process of coming home. One by one the vehicles followed. From outside the convoy this might have looked orderly and unremarkable, a line of dusty armoured trucks moving through another gate, joining the routine motion of a sprawling base. From inside, it was the final transition of the mission. The outside world was no longer spread across the windshield. The road threat was receding behind barriers. The crew could see familiar structures, familiar signs, familiar traffic patterns. The gunner, who had spent hours above the roofline scanning uncertain terrain, was now moving into a place where the threat environment changed sharply. The driver, whose attention had been stretched across road, spacing and unpredictability, was entering a zone with known lanes and known turns. It was not rest yet, but it was the beginning of release. For many convoy crews, the first minutes after clearing the gate were probably among the strangest moments of the day. The body did not immediately believe the road was over. A person could still feel the vibration of movement even as the vehicle rolled onto base roads. The ears were still tuned to radio urgency. The eyes continued to register roadside detail, before remembering that the roadside was now inside a secured compound. Such reactions are difficult to document in a formal mission report, so I want to be careful here. This is a reconstruction rather than a quoted statement, but it fits the conditions described across Army reporting on convoy work. Long hours of vigilance, physical fatigue, and the need to remain attentive until missions were complete. When a person has been scanning for danger for hours, the act of crossing a gate does not instantly erase that mental habit. Once inside, the convoy often did not disperse at random. It moved toward a motor pool, staging area, convoy support centre, receiving yard, or another designated point depending on the mission. During the 2011 drawdown, convoy support centres such as the one at Contingency Operating Station Kalsu became crucial hubs for units moving south toward Kuwait. receiving equipment, assisting convoys, and keeping redeployment traffic organised along the primary route. In more routine sustainment operations, trucks might return from pickups and drop-offs across a base complex or after longer hauls between installations. An Army article from Camp Liberty in 2009 described soldiers convoying daily from a motor pool to handle pickups and deliveries, using up-armoured cargo trucks capable of carrying heavy loads. For those crews, coming back through the gate did not end logistics. It returned the convoy to the place where the next cycle of work began. There is a practical sequence to returning that history rarely lingers on because it lacks spectacle. Vehicles line up, people wait for instructions, loads are accounted for, passengers may dismount, weapons are handled according to local procedure. Crews begin shifting out of the concentrated posture of movement and into the equally demanding work of post-mission tasks. If the convoy had delivered cargo, the paperwork and confirmation did not magically complete themselves. If it had recovered equipment, that equipment had to be turned over. If it had escorted supplies, there were manifests, destination checks, and communications to close out. The war was not simply a sequence of departures and dangers. It was also a great mountain of administrative completion, and every mission had to be turned back into records, repairs, and readiness for the next one. The vehicles themselves demanded attention almost immediately. Army sustainment writing on operations in Iraq noted that once a vehicle returned from a mission, it entered an inspection bay for a post-mission maintenance check. That sentence sounds plain, but there is a great deal contained in it. Every convoy ride imposed wear, dust clogged, heat-stressed systems, tyres took punishment, suspension components worked hard under armour and load, radios and electronic systems had to be checked. If the vehicle had encountered a minor mechanical problem but finished the mission, that problem now had to be identified before it worsened. If there had been damage from road debris, impact or hostile action, it needed to be documented and addressed. Soldiers could be exhausted, but the truck that had carried them out and back still needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Mechanics lived inside this cycle. In 2010, Army maintainers in Iraq described their job in terms of keeping convoys safe on the road and preventing breakdowns outside the wire. They understood that a problem discovered in the motor pool was inconvenient, while the same problem discovered on an Iraqi road could stop an entire convoy and expose it to attack. That awareness made the post-mission inspection more than a routine chore. It was part of tomorrow's survival. The vehicle had made it back today. The mechanics and crews now had to make sure it could go out again. Imagine the drivers stepping down from their vehicles after a long route, legs stiff, shirt damp beneath armour, dust along the sleeves, around the boots, perhaps gathered at the edge of goggles or sunglasses. The cab door opens and heat escapes unevenly. Someone stretches a shoulder that had been held too rigidly around body armour. Someone removes a helmet and rubs a hand across flattened hair. Someone reaches first for water, someone else for a rag, someone else for the inspection checklist because resting comes later. The details of the body are reconstructed, but the conditions are not. Army accounts of convoy life repeatedly describe long hours, intense heat, armoured vehicles, dust, and the physical fatigue of maintaining equipment and vigilance in Iraq. The gunner's return could be its own kind of descent. Hours in a turret meant exposure to sun, wind, and constant motion. Coming back beneath fixed lights and over familiar pavement did not immediately undo that. The gunner climbed down, passed or secured the weapon according to procedure, and rejoined the crew in ordinary height after spending the mission above everyone else. That change sounds small, but it altered perspective. During the ride, the gunner had been the highest set of eyes in the vehicle, working continuously against uncertainty. Back inside the base, they became another exhausted person standing near a dusty truck, waiting for the next instruction. War often shifts people abruptly between very different roles without ceremony. 1 minute scanning the road for threats, the next minute waiting to report equipment status. Then came the debrief. Not every mission produced a dramatic after-action discussion, but debriefing mattered enough that convoy units built structures around it. One Iraq-era Army sustainment article described a logistics convoy briefing room used to plan, brief and debrief every mission, its walls covered with overhead imagery of bridges, intersections, patrol bases, and forward operating bases. That room was a reminder that the mission did not end in memory alone. What crews had seen mattered. A new traffic pattern, a suspicious roadside change, a malfunctioning radio, a route delay, a difficult turn, a vehicle recovery, or a problem with convoy order could become useful information for the next patrol. Another Army article from 2010 described a first-time convoy commander praising his team during an after-action review after they recovered a vehicle efficiently outside the wire. His comment was simple: the team did not panic, the recovery went well, and the main consequence was lost time. That is exactly the kind of moment debriefs preserved. The recovery itself had happened on the road. The review afterward turned it into institutional memory. What worked? What slowed them down? What should be repeated? What should be adjusted? For crews who might run similar roads again tomorrow or next week, these were not academic questions. There is something almost deceptive about the quiet of a post-mission debrief. No engine roar, no road dust hitting the windshield, no gunner scanning rooftops. Just tired people speaking in turn or listening, or trying to summon details from several hours of concentration. Yet this room contained the road in compressed form. The road came back as observations, the gate approach, the stalled truck, the civilian vehicle that cut into the formation, the place where traffic was heavier than expected. The moment someone reported a suspicious object, the interval when the radio was difficult to hear, the convoy that returned without contact could still have a long list of things worth remembering. In that sense, the debrief kept the road from disappearing the moment the convoy reached the motor pool. Accountability also returned. Who was back? Was every vehicle present? Was every crew accounted for? Was any equipment missing, damaged, or in need of immediate replacement? Had any injuries occurred, including those that seemed minor in the moment? Was there a maintenance issue that needed escalation? The Army's broader convoy culture emphasized pre-mission accountability, disciplined movement, and after-action learning. It is reasonable to infer that the return phase served the same logic in reverse. The convoy had to be turned from a moving formation back into known people, known vehicles, and known tasks. If the convoy had been part of a larger redeployment effort late in the war, the return or arrival process could be even more complex. In October 2011, units reaching Four Corners during the Iraq withdrawal were met by teams that helped receive convoys, process equipment, dispose of hazardous materials, and conduct after-action reviews to improve the flow of later movements. That was not a typical daily mission returning to the same base, but it illustrates something important about the broader convoy system. Arrival was an operation in its own right. The act of getting vehicles through a gate or to a support centre did not close the book. It opened another set of tasks designed to keep people and equipment moving through the larger machinery of the war's end. For ordinary convoy crews earlier in the war, the emotional meaning of return could vary depending on the mission. If the route had been calm, relief might arrive quietly and almost guiltily, because nothing had happened and everyone knew that nothing happened was the best outcome. If the convoy had endured a breakdown, a long delay, or a suspicious stop, the arrival might feel more earned. If there had been an attack, the return was not simply relief. It could be stunned silence, anger, exhaustion, or the unsettled feeling of having crossed back into a protected place, while part of the convoy's attention remained outside on the road where the mission changed. The historical sources document these categories of events: breakdowns, recoveries, attacks, and post-mission reviews. The exact inner life of each crew member varied, but the emotional range implied by those experiences was wide. Sometimes the base itself seemed to resume its normal rhythm around them, almost offensively quickly. Other people walked to chow. Someone on a different schedule prepared to go out on a night convoy while the returning crew stripped off gear. A repair team handled a truck as though it were one more item in a long day's work. A radio inside a building carried on with unrelated traffic. The convoy had just completed a mission that consumed the full attention of everyone in it, yet the base had not stopped. It had absorbed their return the way it had absorbed thousands of departures and arrivals before. At Camp Liberty in 2009, Army reporting described this rhythm plainly. As many people returned to their living quarters at dusk, others who conducted nightly convoy operations were preparing to leave. One mission ending overlapped with another beginning. That overlap is important because it shows how convoy duty shaped time on deployment. The end of one route was never entirely separate from the start of the next. Vehicles had to be serviced because they might move again. Crews debriefed because others needed what they had learned. Cargo was turned over because the logistics chain continued beyond the arrival point. Gunners, drivers, and commanders rested in a world where another convoy was already assembling somewhere else on the same base. The road did not disappear when someone reached their bunk. It remained in tomorrow's schedule, and yet, for a little while after coming back through the gate, there were small human permissions that had not existed outside. A helmet could come off, a person could drink without watching the next intersection. Someone could eat something without worrying about whether the vehicle ahead had begun braking. A driver could stand upright without needing to judge distance. A gunner could let the eyes stop sweeping left and right. Even if the full mission closeout still remained, the gate had restored certain ordinary actions. Safety in a war zone was always relative, but the difference between inside and outside the wire was real enough to be felt in the body. I keep thinking about the vehicles after the crews walked away. They sat in motor pools or inspection areas covered in the visible evidence of the route. Dust on the armour, mud or sand around wheel wells, smears across glass, perhaps a chipped surface, a bent mount, a missing piece of external gear, or simply the exhausted appearance of machinery that had done exactly what was asked of it. The Army articles about mechanics and transport units are full of practical respect for these vehicles because everyone understood the arrangement. The trucks did not guarantee survival, but they made movement possible. They carried fuel, ammunition, food, water, people and equipment across a dangerous landscape. They carried crews out, and on the best days carried them back through the gate. There is no trumpet for that return. No dramatic welcome every time a convoy rolled home. Most of the time it was routine by design. It had to be. If every successful return became an emotional ceremony, no unit could function for long. But routine should not be mistaken for insignificance. A convoy that came back intact represented planning that held, vehicles that held, people who stayed attentive, and a road that, for that mission, did not take more than it already had. In a war where supply routes remained dangerous for years, arriving back inside the perimeter mattered. It mattered every time. The day, however, was not entirely finished. Reports still had to be filed, gear still had to be put away, maintenance still had to be done, the body still had to come down from the road, and somewhere inside the returning crew, the mission would begin turning into memory. Not a neat memory, not yet. At first it might remain as fragments. The gate opening, the roadside object that seemed wrong, the radio call that made everyone go quiet, the long hot stretch where no one spoke, the moment the base wall appeared ahead. These fragments would settle differently for each person. Some would fade, some would return years later with surprising clarity. The convoy had crossed back through the gate, but the road did not always stay outside. The convoy had crossed back through the gate, the engines had started to wind down, and the road itself was no longer visible from inside the base. But that did not mean it was gone. For many of the people who spent the Iraq War riding in convoys, the road did not remain in Iraq. It came home in fragments. It stayed in the way certain vehicles looked familiar from too far away. It stayed in the habit of watching road shoulders longer than other drivers did. It stayed in the body's reaction to a sudden loud sound, in the memory of dust on the windshield, in the tension that returned when traffic slowed for no obvious reason. Some memories softened with time, some did not. And this is one of the most important things to understand about convoy duty during the Iraq War. The mission ended when the vehicles returned, but the experience did not always end with it. Years after her 2004 deployment, one Army transportation soldier wrote about driving on a highway in North Carolina and missing a familiar exit by more than 10 miles. She eventually realised that she had fallen in behind a tractor trailer carrying a large shipping container because it resembled the truck she had followed in a wreck. Without consciously choosing to do it, she had slipped back into convoy behaviour on an ordinary American highway. Her account is not a medical diagnosis, and it should not be made into one. It is valuable because it shows how deeply repeated road habits could settle into memory. For an entire deployment, she had spent long days following trucks, watching distances, reading the road, and staying alert because the next stretch of highway might hold something dangerous. Years later, under completely different circumstances, the old pattern reappeared before she noticed it. That same soldier remembered roads punched open by IED blasts, Bailey bridges standing where permanent bridges had been destroyed, the floating bridge over the Tigris where convoys waited so long that they once came under mortar fire, and the anxiety that spread whenever word came that another convoy had been hit. She remembered looking at people's hands as the convoy passed, trying to judge whether someone was signalling, holding something, or preparing to trigger an explosive. She remembered the relief of hearing familiar voices over a CB radio when another convoy from the same unit passed in the opposite direction, because for those few moments, everyone knew those soldiers were still alive. This was convoy memory in its plainest form, not grand strategy, not the language of campaigns, roads, faces, trucks, signals, waiting, and the immediate need to know who had made it through. There is something especially revealing in the way transportation soldiers remembered the ordinary details. Coolers wedged between seats so crews could have cold drinks during 12-hour driving days. Dust coating the face. The shape of a bridge. The sound of a radio channel being searched for familiar voices. The sight of damaged tractors loaded onto trailers after another convoy had been struck. These are the details people carry because they were repeated so often that they became the structure of the deployment. Convoy duty was not one dramatic day. It was a long accumulation of days when the route had to be travelled again, when a vehicle had to be driven again, when a load had to be delivered again, when the same road could look both familiar and threatening at once. For some, what the road left behind was physical injury. The Iraq War produced a generation of service members exposed to blasts from roadside bombs, vehicle-borne explosives, mortars, rockets, and other forms of combat. The Department of Veterans Affairs has continued studying traumatic brain injury among Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, noting that blast exposure can have lasting effects, including difficulties with hearing in complex listening environments, even among veterans whose standard hearing tests appear normal. VA research has also examined the overlap between TBI, post-traumatic stress, memory problems, concentration difficulties, and longer-term functional effects. The point here is not that every convoy rider suffered these outcomes, many did not. The point is that the roadside bomb era of the Iraq War left enough veterans with blast-related injuries that the medical system had to spend years learning how to understand and treat them. One Army story from 2014 described a soldier whose convoy truck was rocked by an IED blast about 300 metres from a combat outpost. The vehicle continued moving. No visible damage appeared obvious, and no one inside seemed physically injured in the immediate sense. Later, he described the blast as having affected his brain rather than his truck. That distinction matters because some convoy injuries were not immediately visible in the way burns, fractures, or amputations were visible. A vehicle might keep driving, a soldier might remain at work. The effects could emerge later in headaches, memory issues, concentration problems, sleep problems, or other symptoms that were much harder to recognize in the moment than a broken axle or a shredded tire. Other survivors carried injuries that could not be hidden. Former Staff Sergeant Bobby Henline survived a 2007 roadside bomb attack in Iraq that killed the other 4 occupants of his Humvee. Army accounts later described severe burns across more than a third of his body and the eventual amputation of his left hand. His life afterward became a story of recovery, public speaking, and work with other wounded veterans. But it began with a convoy vehicle on a road in Iraq. There were many stories like his, each different in detail, each showing how quickly convoy duty could move from routine transportation to lifelong consequence. The road also left behind changes in how the army understood movement. Transportation soldiers had always mattered, but Iraq made it impossible to pretend that logistics movement was safely removed from combat. The Army Transportation Corps Museum later summarised the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by saying that transportation soldiers became frontline soldiers on the roads. That phrase is not decorative. It reflects the reality that truck drivers, escort crews, mechanics, and convoy commanders faced IEDs, ambushes and direct fire threats while performing missions that might once have been categorised as support work. The Iraq experience revived and expanded the study of convoy security, gun trucks, route protection, armoured logistics vehicles, and the relationship between transport and combat in modern war. The roads of Iraq forced material changes as well. Early attacks on convoys led to improvised armour, often called hillbilly armour, as soldiers tried to add protection faster than official production could catch up. Later came greater use of up-armoured Humvees, then the rapid fielding of MRAPs as the IED threat grew more severe. These were not abstract procurement decisions. They were responses to what convoys had experienced on the ground. The lesson was plain. If the road itself had become a battlefield, then vehicles designed mainly for mobility had to be rethought around survivability. That shift became one of the most visible technological legacies of the Iraq War. Tactics changed as well. A soldier returning to Iraq in 2009 compared convoy operations in 2004 with those of the later war. He recalled that earlier convoy procedures were aggressive, that warning shots were common in traffic, and that stopping too long made vehicles feel vulnerable to vehicle-borne explosives or grenade attacks. By 2009, he described a different environment, shaped by the security agreement, greater attention to Iraqi road use, and a changed relationship between American convoys and Iraqi civilians. His account matters because it shows that the war did not stand still. The road taught one set of behaviours during the most dangerous years, then required soldiers to adjust those behaviours as conditions changed. Convoy history in Iraq is not a single frozen picture. It is a record of adaptation under pressure. Those adjustments did not erase what had happened earlier. In 2004, the war for the roads intensified sharply. Transportation Corps histories of that period describe large-scale convoy ambushes, changing insurgent tactics, and attacks that left fuel tankers burning, vehicles abandoned, soldiers and civilian drivers wounded and some killed. One official study of the April 2004 uprising noted that no convoy in Iraq since the end of the invasion had faced an ambush as large or intense as the attack near Abu Ghraib on Good Friday. The road became a major arena of the war, and those who served on it carried the knowledge that logistics had been contested with deadly seriousness. The effects of convoy duty did not belong only to the people who were wounded. Units waiting on a base for news of a hit convoy felt the road as well. Families back home felt it through delays, casualty notifications, and the strange difficulty of understanding what a truck driver or escort gunner had actually faced. The Army transportation soldier who reflected on her 2004 deployment wrote that after returning, she sometimes encountered people who assumed that, as a woman and a truck driver, she'd never really left the comfort of a base. That misunderstanding is historically important. It shows how convoy service could be underestimated by people who carried older assumptions about combat, support roles, and who was exposed to danger. The Iraq roads complicated all of those assumptions. This was especially true for women who served in transportation units, military police, medical roles, and other specialties that regularly moved outside the wire before formal combat role policies caught up with battlefield reality. The transportation soldier's account makes that point through experience rather than policy language. She drove long missions, saw wounded vehicles, watched road shoulders, encountered civilians in tense situations, and returned home to people who imagined her service had been safely removed from combat. Convoy history helps correct that false picture. It shows that exposure to danger in Iraq did not always follow the old categories neatly. A person could be assigned to logistics and still spend deployment after deployment moving through roads where bombs, gunfire and ambushes were real possibilities. The medical response to these wars also reveals what the road left behind. By the late 2000s, the military was already exploring therapies designed to help service members process combat memories, including virtual environments that recreated aspects of Iraq in controlled clinical settings. Army reporting on Virtual Iraq described its use in helping some patients access traumatic memories through simulated war zone sights and sounds under therapist supervision. That does not mean convoy memories were identical for everyone, or that one treatment explained all post-deployment struggles. It does show that the sensory world of the war, including roads, vehicles, explosions, and the environment around them, had become part of the long aftermath clinicians were trying to understand. The road also stayed behind in institutional memory. Case studies, convoy security histories, transportation corps publications, and unit histories preserved lessons that might otherwise have disappeared into personal recollection. They documented the return of gun trucks, the importance of convoy rehearsals, the need for route intelligence, the vulnerability of supply lines, and the reality that enemy tactics changed whenever American forces adapted. The Army had learned convoy lessons before, especially in Vietnam, but Iraq forced many of those lessons back to the centre of military thinking under new technological conditions. The road was not only a place where convoys travelled, it became a school, and the tuition was often brutal. By 2011, the war had entered its final American withdrawal phase. On December 18, 2011, the last major troop convoy left Iraq. More than 100 vehicles and 500 soldiers moving from contingency operating base Adda toward Kuwait before dawn. As the final trucks crossed at Kabari Crossing, the gate behind them was closed. Army reporting noted that details of the final trip had been kept quiet so insurgents would not know the exact timing of the departure. Even at the end, the last convoy was treated as a convoy in a dangerous country, not as a parade. That final movement has a clean place in history because it marks a boundary. The last large American convoy rolled out. The gate closed. The television cameras captured an ending. But the people who had spent earlier years on the roads did not all receive such a simple transition. Their own convoy wars ended in different ways. Some finished a deployment and came home. Some redeployed later. Some left the service. Some continued in logistics units shaped by what Iraq had taught them. Some lived with injuries. Some returned to ordinary driving and found that ordinary driving no longer felt entirely ordinary. A highway shoulder, a parked car, a tractor trailer, or a traffic slowdown could pull memory forward without warning. That is not an exaggeration added for drama. It is visible in the personal accounts and the medical research that followed the war. And so, when we ask what it was like riding in a convoy during the Iraq War, the answer cannot stop at the gate. It has to include what happened afterward. It was the briefing before departure and the dust after sunrise. It was the cramped vehicle interior and the radio call that sharpened everybody in the cab. It was the road shoulder, the culvert, the bridge, the parked sedan, the sudden halt, the returning gate. It was also the later memory of those things, preserved in someone's driving habits, in a clinic, in a rehabilitation ward, in a transportation corps study, in a reunion conversation, in the silence after someone mentioned a route name that everyone in the room still understood. If you picture one final scene, let it be practical rather than grand. A convoy has completed its run. The vehicles sit inside the wire again, coated in dust. Mechanics move toward them with tools and checklists. Crews climb down stiffly, some speaking, some not. Somewhere, another convoy is already being planned. Years later, far from Iraq, one of those drivers is on a civilian highway and notices a truck in front of them, notices the space between vehicles, notices the shoulder, notices more than the situation requires. Then they realise what they are doing. The road had ended, but not entirely.